Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're starting part 1 of an awesome What If Deku had an eternal reincarnation quirk story. If you want to see part 2, drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Now let's jump into the story. Izuku Midoriya was numb. The type of numbness that leaves noises drowned below rivers, vision clouded in fog, touch distant, as if his fingers were frozen. Numbness felt like a sort of violent sea, waves crashing into his mood and submerging him in almost suffocating silence. This feeling wasn't exactly new, especially to him, but it was weird for it to occur today. The disassociation he experienced was often a result of something, whether emotional or physical, but today it was simply there. His tent was below a bridge, one that passed over a small river in the more rural areas of Musutofu. It was often quiet, with the occasional car or frequent biker. Only the gentle sounds of flowing water and cicadas in the grass could break the peace. The only other occupant of the underpass was Mr. Wannabe, a kind elderly man who was able to make a bit of cash from neighborhood chores. That's how Izuku managed to stay fed after leaving home. The man was kind, much more than his parents, if he could be so generous as to call them that. They'd been in America for over 4 years now, having disowned their quirkless son at the meager age of the process had been swift and easy for the two elder Midoriyas, and Izuku was taken in by child services within a week. He'd run from his first foster home barely a month later and was both thankful and disappointed that no one had come to get him back. So here he was, numb in the early morning of a appealing day, with a bottle of peach water and a half-eaten container of white rice from the family mart. He'd thank Watanabe when they both got back that evening. He went through the motions, eating, walking, sitting, and writing. School was always simple. Beyond the typical neglect and outright abuse many quirkless children faced in the school system, Izuku's actual education went relatively smoothly. He had one teacher, a kind woman by the name of Honda, who was thankfully in charge of organizing the students' grades and academic work. She had little influence over the sheer amount of discrimination Old Dera Middle suffered with on student records, but she treated Izuku's grades fairly. That's truly all he could have hoped for. See, Izuku Midoriya was an intelligent boy, incredibly analytical and logical when it came to how he perceived the world. Though empathetic, the kid had issues understanding certain concepts and ideas when they contradicted basic facts and principles. Either way, he was smart, incredibly so. And despite his lack of tact in regular social settings, he was smart enough to keep his mouth shut around Katsuki Bakugo. He vaguely remembered the boy from their childhood, though the memories weren't very clear. Considering he was when he'd gotten his diagnosis, he'd been almost immediately pulled from elementary school and hadn't seen the blonde until well into junior high, when they were put in the same second-year class. Izuku hadn't recognized him at first, and it was plausible Bakugo hadn't either. But that signature sickly sweet smell was a dead give. It was one-sided acknowledgement for a week before their absolute bigot case of a homeroom professor announced his quirklessness aloud. Recognition came over Bakugo's features, and a target was placed snugly between Izuku's shoulder blades. The blonde wasn't ever overly hostile towards Izuku, at least not verbally. There were times he'd outright beat him, assault, if we're being direct, though it was really odd. He never said a word, never jeered or spat at Izuku like the other lackeys he begrudgingly led around. He was always quiet when burning marks into the smaller boy, focused and violent. He'd stare at the mottled canvas of bubbling red flesh and peeling pale skin. He'd stare with an unwavering expression, his crimson-red eyes almost mirroring the mutilated body before him in its grotesque state. Today was no different, and Izuku was passively thankful to be so disassociated. The gods above could only know of the white-hot pain he'd be experiencing right now, blackened flesh on his shoulder, flaky and warped, pus oozing from the hand-shaped wound. Today shouldn't have been different. It really shouldn't have, but with a single whisper of death on Bakugo's tongue, the dynamic changed. Take a swan dive off the roof, do yourself a favor. It cut through the safety of the ocean waves, ripping him above the tide to crash into violent waves, salt water down his throat, and ice in his veins. It shook him to his core. Sure, he'd been suicide-baited before, but it hadn't been like this. The blonde had been so horribly earnest, so genuine in his statement that it was almost a command. He'd never been affected by people's words before, but when submerged back beneath the water, with numbness so deep in his bones he couldn't feel the ground beneath his feet, he could do nothing but take it. Take it as thick green mucus filled his lungs, resigned to clawing out of nothing but human instinct at the villain's slimy green flesh. He couldn't breathe. He didn't mind. He didn't care when 𝐼𝐺, an older favorite of his and the #1 hero, was the one to rescue him. He didn't feel anything when he was accidentally dragged by the leaping hero due to an unfortunate loop in his back that had caught on the pro's breathes. He barely registered the question falling from his lips. Can I still save people without a quirk? Didn't process the crushing words. No, I don't see how. The words clouded over, whisked away by the waves, and gone with the man who'd disappeared from the roof. Izuku's brain kept many irrational decisions from even daring to fully form, anything from impulsive actions to stupid thoughts. It's a shame that one man's words had such an impact, could sever the ties his logic had on his consciousness, on his decision-making. He stepped casually towards the edge, his bag still on his back and his feet firmly planted in his shoes. His throat burned from the likely toxic bacteria that had entered his system, his shoulder ached with the mottled mess of peeling inflamed skin, and his limbs were sore from the day's taxing strain. He stepped without hesitation, as if taking a simple stroll. There was no waver in his pace, no stop and go, nothing but a direct trajectory from the roof center to falling swiftly down. He watched the building's tinted windows as he plummeted, smiled when he felt the ground near, and laughed moments before he collided with the pavement. His body cracked sickeningly with the impact, pain overflowing his senses until he could feel absolutely nothing. There was nothing. It was quiet, so dark, so absolutely nothing for the briefest of moments. It was so calming until he felt a thud in his chest. So fleeting when his index finger twitched. So hopeful, until his eyes fluttered open. 0. It took an embarrassingly long amount of time for Izuku to actually begin processing what the F just happened. He'd bolted up at a 90-degree angle a few minutes after his eyes opened to a starless night sky. He hadn't even noticed the time of day when he jumped or stepped off the roof. Observing his surroundings, he'd landed somewhere near a side street, off to the side of the main entrance of the building. It was a one-lane street with a thin sidewalk and many condemned buildings along the road. This area of town used to be central Musutafu during the pre-Quirk era, and now that the city's center has moved to a much more modern cluster of buildings, the area here is largely considered abandoned. Crime was a popular activity, but it was thankfully rather quiet. After his surroundings, Izuku took note of a far more pressing matter. His BLD was pulled beneath him, soaking uncomfortably into his uniform and already clotting beneath his hands. It was gross, absolutely vile, but interesting. He was intact, alive, with BLD pumping healthily through his veins, despite the large sticky puddle of his own BLD. That was just it, though, his body was working in perfect health. Izuku was not healthy. His body was intact, but it wasn't ever this intact. Gone was the grotesque hand shape on his shoulder, vanished were starburst scars and deep wounds along his torso, free was he of muscle fatigue and lingering exhaustion. He was in mint condition. It was honestly fascinating. He quickly flung his bag off, grimacing at the BLD-soaked bottom but navigating his notebook out of its safe pouch. He didn't really trust it not to get damaged, especially with how much he got flung around. Flipping it open to a blank page, he internally grieved the neatness of volume before he'd begun neatly organizing his analysis. Volume 7 to 10 were a mess of word vomit and thought garbage. Unfortunately, analyzing what actually happened to him was an occasion that warranted rambling barf, and thus the death of Volume 13's spiff organization. He began to write with one simple sentence. Izuku Midoriya Quirk. He sat for a moment, tapping his pencil against the page, before he was diving in. Is it immortality? No, that's silly because I very clearly ceased a heartbeat. Reincarnation? Most likely. Though self-regeneration is not out of the question, the heart can restart itself after all. It would explain why I have no wounds. Why it heals scars. But it shouldn't have manifested only now. So reincarnation. Does it have a limit? How many times could I die until it's permanent? Would a certain type of death cancel everything out and halt me from waking up? Would I ever gain scars? Do I heal now that my quirk is active? Or do I only regenerate after I've died? How long do I remain dead? What are the side effects? Is it only when I kill myself? No, that's illogical. Even though I chose to jump off the roof, the ground, impact, momentum and everything involved killed me. If I kill someone, could I bring them back? He paused. Yeah, that was a bit dark, wasn't it? He never really dwelled on being called creepy, weirdo, stalker, or freak. He'd heard them before, and if he were any less intelligent, he'd probably take it a lot worse. Unfortunately for his aggressors, he was smart enough to know how important analysis is in the hero community. It's valuable to civilians with all sorts of harmful quirks. How necessary it is when treating quirked patients. He knew analysis wasn't creepy, but that point was a bit grim. Would I have to be the one to end their life? Or could I resurrect any dead person? Does my quirk only affect me? If I can, how would that work? Stupid thought. I can't resurrect the dead. I likely can't heal others either. My injuries are healed though, so are my scars. How severe would an injury need to be to regenerate after death? Would it be any at all? Only when a certain qualifier is met. He once again took a pause. Was this a one-time thing? He murmured absently. And yeah, it was pretty impulsively stupid of him to do this, but he was anything if not a very curious boy. So, peeling himself off of the concrete, he gagged at the squelch of BLD in his shoes. Pushing past the absolutely nauseating feeling of BLD-soaked breathes, he climbed the fire escape on the building side, leaving a red trail behind that honestly blended with the bright red paint peeling from the metal. Once on the roof, he had even less hesitation, skipping off the roof with a tilt to dive headfirst onto the street again. Maybe the head would cause a different outcome, considering that was where the quirk factor was stored. You know, in the brain. He landed with a wet crunch, feeling that the familiar safety of the unfeeling void would overtake him once again. Maybe it was because he was anticipating seeing the sky again, or maybe the more he died, the easier it got. Maybe the regeneration of all his scars and wounds healing made the process take longer. Maybe the head injury was close enough to the quirk factor to activate it faster. Either way, his fingers gained feeling in what felt like a shorter amount of time than before, his heart hammering in his chest as he sat up. He smacked his lips, whipping BLD that was dripping from his forehead and spitting out what had pooled in his mouth. His hair was matted with it, with clots in his bangs and dripping into his eyes. It was a bit gross, actually, it was a lot gross. However, it did bring something into question. If his limb was cut off, would it reattach to his body, or would he grow a whole new one? Would he be able to regrow lost organs? That's a fascinating, if not unsettling, thought. Could he have someone remove all his organs for donation and simply come back with a new, perfectly healthy, well-functioning system? He whipped the BLD from his hands on the front of his uniform shirt, which had stayed relatively undrenched, before scooping up his notebook. It was only a few minutes of note-taking when he heard frantic footsteps slapping at the ground. Snapping his head up, Izuku spotted a vaguely familiar silhouette. It took a few seconds for him to give a name to the shapes of flowing thin fabric and dark hair, but when the hero, slid to his side, it clicked. Pro-Hero Eraserhead. Izuku watched as Eraserhead visibly tensed at the mention of his hero name. Underground heroes weren't always away from the limelight, especially if they were sunset heroes. That was the unofficial term for underground heroes with a media presence. That included Miss Joke, Pop Step, Nightlight, and Edgeshot. Versus underground heroes like Eraserhead consisted of Kasajiraman, Whisper, Rocklock, and Boogie Boy. The later part of the list remained almost entirely out of the population's eyes, and many didn't have agencies either. Independent heroes, while not unheard of in limelight, were often reserved for the underground scene due to their nature. Instead of an agency paying their wages, a name given by those unfortunate enough to rely on them in their communities are paid directly from the government, in accordance with their cases and patrols. It's complicated, and one of the reasons Izuku swore off hero accounting while searching for alternate heroic careers. So, in short, Izuku fully understood Eraserhead's surprise. He rarely gave his heroes names to civilians he saved, and when he does, those civilians are usually too distressed to remember much about him. Well, from what Izuku's heard, He's part of a small subforum dedicated to him, one within an underground hero fan community. So, of course, being his favorite hero, Izuku was immediately alight with excitement. Unfortunately, it seemed any nerd out would have to wait because the pro was currently attempting to ask Izuku questions about the gargantuan amount of BLD, and Izuku, stupidly, wasn't responding. Sorry, repeat all of those questions. He chuckled sheepishly, staring up at the pro, who'd snapped his jaw shut when the kid actually responded. With a grunt, he started again. Are you hurt? Was the simple first question. Which was odd. Usually, one would ask what happened, but this was an easier question to answer. Luckily, no, I'm actually feeling better than I have in years, he said, standing up in the pool to shake his limbs. It dripped more into his shoes and squelched rather loudly, making both of them wince. Though I understand the confusion. He tacked on. Eraserhead had a set jaw, concern etched into the skin around his eyes, but brows set in a harsh pull. He pushed his goggles, terribly designed, really onto his head before asking Izuku another question. Is this your BLD, kid? He asked in an even tone. Izuku snorted. Yes, it is. Don't worry, I'm not another child killer, he assured, waving off the notion as he grabbed his bag. It dripped, and he shook the sack to get any build-up off. Slightly bloody was better than soaked. Right? Okay. What were you doing in a pile of your own BLD? The hero questioned further. Izuku wondered if he had this no-nonsense tone with all the civilians he encountered or if Izuku was just special. Killing myself, actually, he answered simply, throwing the straps over his shoulders. He winced after a second, because that was really poor tact. I'm okay now, though, clearly. He looked at the hero, whose scarlet eyes had widened just a bit. I swear it won't happen again, guarantee it, actually. The hero stood up himself, hiding the lower half of his face in the grey scarf he always wore. You can't actually guarantee that, he pointed out bluntly. Izuku shrugged. I mean, you aren't wrong, he huffed, beginning to walk out of the side street, but I can guarantee with at least 50% accuracy that it won't kill me. He compromised, though the argument was weak even to his own ears. Which says a lot, because if this is a quirk, and if it does prevent death, the fact is only half sure means the intelligent hero is likely even less convinced. Said man followed Izuku onto the main road, still relatively deserted but not outright empty like the side street. I have to bring you to the station, you know, it's procedure to inform a parent or guardian of a suicide attempt since it's illegal, for some reason. He grumbled out, eyeing Izuku as if to dare him to attempt an escape. He won't, though. Sorry, I'm disowned. Not parents to speak of, Mr. Eraserhead, sir, he joked, but stopped to allow the pro to walk in front, in the direction of the precinct. No foster home. Shelter. Eraserhead asked over his shoulder, how old are you anyway? Izuku upped his pace, feeling gross having to basically jog in half-dry breaths. It was starting to overstimulate him a bit, it was nothing he wasn't overly used to masking. He eventually stepped up beside the taller man and evened his pace. Ran away from my first and only foster home I'm 15 now. He answered simply. Your caseworker didn't file anything. Izuku snorted, I'm quirkless. Well, legally, I guess after today, I'm not so sure that's true. He mused. The hero just hummed, a curious glint dancing in his eyes. The walk was silent from there, with Izuku pulling uncomfortably at his breathed legs and the hero remaining vigilant for any activity. Why they were walking, Izuku didn't actually know, but it was nicer than sitting in the back of a cop car. Naomasa should have known it wouldn't be a slow night. He was a detective in the middle of Musutafu, Tokyo, working with heroes like Eraserhead, Whisper, and Pop Step. He didn't get easy nights. Unfortunately, common sense didn't alleviate headaches, and the migraine that Eraserhead brought into the station today was in the shape of a teenage boy. So, your name is Izuku Midoriya? He asked, adjusting the recorder he'd informed all parties about. Eraser was sitting in the corner of the room, while the boy was in front of him. He was looking worse for wear, BLD-soaked clothes, matted green hair, dirt all over. The BLD was a more pressing matter, but the kid had said it was his own. 𝐿 would confirm that, but for now, he'd take his word for it. Especially with Eraserhead here. Yeah, true, but Izuku is fine. The detective nodded, writing quickly. How old are you? 15. True Quirk. No clue. True, he frowned. Excuse me. You're excused, the kid grinned before sheepishly clearing his throat. Sorry, well, I'm quirkless on paper, true, but I'm not so sure I am anymore. True, the man leaned back in his chair with a huff. All right, and why do you say that? Well, I mean, I tried to kill myself. I felt the whole heart-stopping thing, then I wasn't dead. True, then I tried again to see if it was a fluke, and I woke up again. True, he took a deep breath. Okay, so legally you're quirkless, is that the reason you tried to end your life? The kid, Izuku, shrugged. Yes and no, it was sort of spur of the moment. True. He admitted. 𝐿 clicked his pen a few times before writing this down and continuing the interview. Therapy wasn't his job, but he could certainly recommend it. 0. It took an hour for the entire statement process to be over, and an extra 45 minutes when Eraserhead was giving his own. By the time he was led to a waiting room, Izuku was exhausted. It was nearly 2:30 a.m., and they still had to wait for the paperwork to go through. Then even more time when they figured out where to actually put him. Sorry, when dealing with kids, it takes way too long. Eraser grumbled, coming back from a vending machine to hand Izuku a bottle of water. The hero cracked open his coffee and slumped into the chair beside him. Thanks. He smiled, uncapping the bright packaging and relishing the cool water down his throat. It wasn't anything like suffocating on human sludge or the familiar burn of salty ocean water. It was nice. He eyes the space, all sterile walls and lights that were a bit too bright. There was a bit of color in the form of a short woman at the secretary desk. She had scarlet red hair, pale skin, and dark eyes, with antennae coming from her head. They bobbed along to the music she was humming, tapping away at a computer in a way that should have been irritating but was actually quite melodic. He wondered what the antennas were, even if there were only two possibilities. Either they were her quirk themselves or a gene mutation. If it was the latter, he was curious what her quirk truly was. Considering she was rather sonically tuned, maybe a hearing-based quirk or voice. That's Hayami-san. Eraserhead grunted, snapping Izuku's eyes from the woman. He was staring. Which is kind of embarrassing, he tried to train out that habit ages ago. Oh, she seems chipper. Izuku answered a bit awkwardly. He wasn't really in the mood to talk, his fingers twitching. He had no information on her physically beside the antenna and was dying to spend time working. A bit too chipper. The pro retorted, eyeing Izuku from the corner of his eye. He took a breath. Listen, you might end up being placed temporarily under my guardianship. Izuku froze, hand tensing as his head whipped to the side. The hero looked impassive, but he was burying his lower face in the gray scarf. He seemed nervous. Izuku didn't know why, of all people, he should be the one bubbling with nerves. After all, Eraserhead was his favorite hero. Izuku had grown out of childish fanboying, instead developing a sort of fixation on heroes in a different way. The system fascinated him in all its flaws and necessities, from how hero agencies operated, to morality, to gear, and history. The entire hero system fascinated him, and Eraserhead was one of his favorites to spend time on. Even with little to no information about him, he knew Eraserhead was an incredibly efficient pro, with a really complex moral compass and a sort of apathetic compassion that was difficult to understand. It worked for Izuku, though. It was a direct sort of care that didn't involve unnecessary pleasantries or false empathy. He didn't try to connect with victims, sympathize with villains, or draw lines between what someone's reason was. He trusted his gut when reading situations and often spared people who deserved to be spared. Being told he'd likely be placed with him was causing his bones to practically vibrate, his chest tight as his face contorted in a really awkward smile. What was most exciting, however, do all underground heroes have emergency foster licenses, or are sunset pros like Miss Jokes exempt? His hands itched. His bag was in a locker right now, and that was his notebook. Eraserhead, to his credit, seemed to almost expect the question, despite his slightly narrowed brows. Miss Joke has an emergency license, but I'm pretty sure Crawler, Nightlight, and Pop Step declined. He shifted in his seat. To answer, it's not mandatory, but most accept the offer to have it, even with the checks and home visits. He said this, referring to the CPS strict guidelines when it comes to the parent side of the foster system. It seemed even tighter with pro heroes. Izuku nodded. So unlike Limelight heroes, they do get an official offer, he hummed. Since most Limelight heroes are outright barred from foster work, it's harder for those heroes to adopt, especially in the top 5, let alone pass the parental side of the foster system. I do wish the kids were monitored as closely, they get treated pretty badly half the time, but I understand. If the parents had misqualifications, that's on the CPS, but if the kid's a problem, that's easier to cover up. You know, I think it's a fascinating thing that most underground heroes are required to have those licenses. Sure, heroes in general can have temporary guardianship, but that's a 24-hour thing for rescue victims or hostage situations. Underground pros deal with things like quirk trafficking, domestic issues, and cult activity. It's only logical to have that necessity in place. His thoughts were cut off when a small hand waved at a safe, non-STMLTNG distance from his face. Hayami-san was in front of him, handing him his bag as she held a thin stack of paperwork. Finally with us, Mr. She smiled gently, letting him take the now dry bag before handing Eraser the small stack of papers. The hero immediately began to sign, and Izuku was preoccupied with pushing on the underside of his bag, feeling the dry BLD crunch and warp his bag. You, he said instead of responding, pulling a giggle from the woman. Yeah, it's pretty damaged. I made sure nothing was too destroyed on the inside after my friends conducted a quick search. Your analysis is really well written, you could go pro. She praised happily, rocking on her heels. Izuku looked at her, a bit confused since that was a really weird sentence, but it was then that he spotted a centipede on her shoulder. He then saw a few ladybugs in her hair, a stink bug on the collar of her button-down, and a moth on the cuff of her sleeve. Bugs. He muttered, patting blindly at his zipper for volume 0. He was sent off with Eraserhead about 25 minutes later. It likely would have been quicker, but Hayami-san indulged his curiosity and answered his question. Her quirk was called entokinesis, and it boiled down to bug control. Beyond simple communication, she could also mentally connect her brain to theirs, being able to see through their eyes and experience things through them. She had emotional connections with them, and her antenna allowed her to properly navigate her surroundings when she was too connected to an insect friend. According to her, Eraserhead's partner really disliked her quirk. Said partner was apparently already in the apartment, along with, apparently, their child. Izuku was dying to write that down. Eraserhead was not only married but had an actual child. Speaking of partners, present MIC. Eraserhead's apartment was actually really nice. The style was shockingly maximalist, with overgrown houseplants, hanging decor, and warm lighting. Yellows, greens, browns, and oranges in various muted to vibrant shades, wood floors, and old furniture. And finally, there in the center was the voice hero present MIC. It wasn't entirely shocking, at least not fully. Anyone who'd have the patience as a homeless kid to sit outside electronic stores for Sports Fest reruns would know that students Aizawa Shouter and Hisashi Yamada were close, alongside Tatami Shinsu and Shirakumo Aboro. The latter two had an interesting history themselves, and while Shirakumo was a tragedy, Tatami Shinsu grew up to be the underground hero Whisper. While the first two just so happened to be the adults he was standing with right now. You married present MIC? He asked Eraserhead excitedly, rocking on his heels. This was fascinating information, and he was a bit jittery that two really good heroes were still close after school and married at that. That he certainly did, little listener, practically begged me for years. The voice hero swooned, dipping his body to drape gangly limbs over his spouse, who grumbled back. You proposed to me. Izuku stood awkwardly, watching his idols dance around each other, literally like a married couple. He laughed self-consciously, toeing off his shoes and grimacing with an audible gurgle as the dried BLD flaked off his socks. This snapped the other two to attention, and Izuku was whisked off by a blonde-haired hippie for a change of clothes, a shower, and a laundry run to clean his backpack after taking his necessities out. The shower was delightful. He was given access to any of the many colorful products, and there was no limit to his warm water use. He has a fresh, warm towel to bundle in afterwards, a comfy set of gray sweat breathes, and a yellow sweatshirt. He was directed to their spare room, a quaint space with the same maximalist hippie vibe as the main house. He laid his things, which they just tossed around haphazardly, neatly on the dresser and left his notebook under the bed. Checking the space for anything dangerous or worrisome, he eventually felt satisfied and left for the living room. There they are. Present 𝐼𝐶 cheered, whisking Izuku to the sofa and practically moving a warm mug of cocoa into his hands. How was the wash-up, little listener? Izuku smiled, swinging his legs a bit. It was nice, much better than the bathhouses. Eraserhead grumbled in agreement, flopping into a mustard-yellow love seat by the fireplace. How they had a fireplace in an apartment complex made very little sense, but he supposed this was a pretty big apartment. It likely cost a fortune. So, the man began, shuffling as his spouse snuggled into his side, also holding a cup of cocoa. My name is Aizawa Shouter, you can call me what you'd like, and of course I assume you know 𝐼𝐶 as Yamada Hisashi. The other spoke up then, I'll let you know now, little listener, I use he/him pronouns, but I identify as a non-binary man. Do you know what that means? He wondered, not unkindly. Izuku nodded. I use he/him too, what about, Mr. Eraserhead? He asked, still unsure if he should just call his hero by name. The man in question, apparently also he/him, insisted on being called Mr. Aizawa since his students called him that anyway. Our kiddo uses they/them, but they are currently fast asleep, so you'll meet them tomorrow morning. Hopefully after you've gotten a good night's rest. Mr. 𝐼𝐶 explained, and Izuku nodded. He'd gone through the house rules with the two heroes and was pleasantly surprised with how easy they were to both follow and grasp. The majority were a given. Basically, don't damage the apartment, keep tidy, do your chores if given any, etc. Then there were the more hero-specific rules. Don't invite anyone over without clearing it with both adults. Don't let anyone into or out of the house after 1 a.m. or before 6 a.m. Always speak while facing present 𝐼𝐶. He doesn't always wear his hearing aids at home and may have to read your lips. Don't speak to Eraserhead after his patrols until he's taken off his goggles. He gets stuck in work mode and may attack you if startled. There were a few more, but they were small rules like turning off lights before leaving the room or something. He'd written them all down in one of his plain notebooks. He had access to lots of them through Aldera's school supply, which Miss Honda allowed him to stock up on for free. His hero analysis books were the green ones, and any other would be labeled on the gray ones. He'd started a new one to document his time here and to act as a reference for the new lifestyle. Growing up homeless instilled habits in you that he knew weren't necessary when living in a home. If he was someone else, he'd likely have a much harder time breaking these habits, but he was used to adapting. Crawling into the quilted sheets of the spare room, he almost instantly drifted off into a pleasant sleep, exhausted from the day's events, of course. He was also never granted the privilege of such a welcoming and comfortable bed to sleep in. It was nice. The next few days were hectic, very hectic, actually. The first thing that occurred was his removal from Aldera Middle. He hadn't given them many details on his schooling, but either way, he was moved to the same middle school as Nito. Nito Ayama, previously Minoma, the only child of the pro-heroes present 𝐼𝐶 and Eraserhead, and a DMN near insufferable flatmate. Don't get him wrong, Izuku actually really liked this kid, but they were very difficult to fully coexist with. Not only was Nito extremely high maintenance and well spoiled, they were also annoyingly humble about it. It made their seemingly privileged and entitled behavior all the more frustrating since they were clearly self-aware and respectful of the things around them, despite their cocky attitude. It sparked that bitter part of Izuku, the part that Mr. Watanabe had been sure to keep Izuku aware of but never fed. The old man had been incredibly important in Izuku's upbringing, at least morally, and it pained him to admit he was having trouble staying grateful after watching this blonde kid live such a wonderful life. Speaking of Mr. Watanabe, though, Izuku was pretty hasty to inform him of the whole living situation change. The man had wept with Izuku, glad he was off the streets and in a safe place for the time being. With the promise to visit, they went their separate ways, Izuku to school and Watanabe to work. Now, a month later, Izuku was sitting in his third PO, mind wandering into the literal abyss as he lay face first on his desk. Mr. Aizawa and Yamada had casually brought up the possibility of legally adopting him that morning. So very casually, just over a cup of tea and some heavily buttered toast. Somehow the topic was dodged like an Olympic medal was on the line, and Nito dragged Izuku's dazed but to class stumbling and sputtering. Earth to Zuku. The familiar drawl of his desk mate tickled his ears. He lay for a few more minutes before he felt his shoulder shake. Lifting his head, he was face to face with dark, insect eyes mere inches from his face, curtained by rosy red hair and brows drawn into a frown. Whatever is the matter, Izuku? Ame Ishigo pressed worriedly. She had a firefly quirk and had a backless chair to accommodate the stiff elytron or wing case that covered her wings. She'd spun around to face them, glancing between Izuku and her brother. Are you sick? His deskmate and Hayame's brother wondered. Shinsu Hitoshi, a tall, gangly boy with a brainwashing quirk and tired silver eyes. He sighed, letting a smile grace his features. I mean, I'm all right in general. Just thinking. He assured. The siblings shared a look, as they often did, before changing the subject seamlessly. He appreciated the way they interacted with him. Shinsu was incredibly direct and very blunt, even if he was prone to dramatic sarcasm. Hayami was similar in her directness, but she was soft-spoken and gentle, polite in her speech even when everyone, including her parents, encouraged her to speak familiarly with them. Shinsu said it was her preference but didn't explain why. So when Mai finally took the time to buy herself a new jacket, her previous one was terribly damaged. There was a hole straight through the arm, I fear. Hayami sighed wistfully, finishing a story Izuku didn't quite catch. Mai, or Hatsumai, was in the class next door to them. She was an incredibly talented inventor and was lucky enough to have access to the resources to make high-quality items thanks to her father. He was Hatsume Natsu, a brilliant inventor who'd worked on support items for heroes like Endeavor all the way to teams like the Wild Pussycats. He'd never properly had a conversation with her beyond a few isolated discussions about the sciences, but he knew she was Hayame's childhood friend. She was also close with Shinsu, and the three walked home together often. As Izuku grew closer to the siblings, he hoped to start actually befriending Hatsume. She was incredibly intelligent, and she had a fascinating mind. I don't think he's all there, Ishigo. Shinsu mused, tapping the desk in front of Izuku, who just blinked up. He went to apologize again, but Nito's voice cut through the buzz of the class noise. Izuku! They yelled. Which was unnecessary, it was free study, everyone was pretty calm, just talking amongst themselves, but it got the point across, so Izuku got up. Following them into the hall, he didn't have to ask before the blonde started talking. Listen, I'm sorry they dropped that on you so early. They said, looking down at the pastel blue and yellow of their nails. They had little white cloud widgets on them, which matched this week's weather-themed hair clips and casual wear. Nito was extremely into Yume kawaii and decora fashion, often modeled for multiple magazines, and did a few brand deals on their social media. This week's theme, again, was weather. Last week was fast food. They liked themes. Izuku actually caught on to what they'd said a few seconds later. Why are you apologizing? Nothing negative that occurred was your fault, there's nothing to be sorry for. He said, a bit of confusion seeping into his tone. He found apologizing for things you had no say in was illogical. Nito seemed to disagree and also felt the need to clarify. I knew they were going to offer it this morning. I'm just sorry I didn't warn you. I feel sorry you got so shocked. They explained directly. Nito was incredibly skilled when it came to handling Izuku's less-than-stellar social skills. It was honestly impressive how quick and patient they were when explaining the reasons people do illogical things. According to them, it often boils down to emotion, empathy, or a sense of morality. However, societal expectations and norms also play a confusing role. They watched each other for a moment, comfortable in the silence, as Izuku thought. I guess when you put it like that, Well, I appreciate the apology, even if it's not for anything substantial, he chuckled, pleased to see the tension leave Nito's shoulders. Okay, cool. So, you think you'll accept the offer? They asked, spinning on their heels to lean against the wall. The building was a colorful mix of beige, purple, and yellow in its paint, uniforms, and logo. A school that had many hero children attending, as well as a large number of students with quirks dangerous enough for extracurricular quirk counseling, a medical field that didn't get nearly enough credit. Because of this, the rules were extremely tight when it came to some things, but the education process was very flexible, as was much of the curriculum. This made the two of them meeting in this hall possible, if not strict in where they could wander. They liked knowing where the students were. So they stood by the door of Izuku's class for simplicity. I don't know. He answered simply, gazing out the windows, the sky speckled with clouds. I think I'll accept, but I don't know why it was offered to begin with. He admitted, and Nito chuckled. I thought the same. I'm sure you'll get there eventually. They mused, drumming their acrylics against the wall. The silence dragged on, and unlike the usual uncomfortable tension Izuku feels around the blonde, this silence was nice. He was warming up to Nito and the whole Aoyama household as a whole. If they wanted him, he'd be a bit reluctant to refuse. Being wanted wasn't a feeling he'd shut out. It took the group an embarrassingly long time to stop the tears, and even longer to get everyone fully settled. Clearing the table was something Izuku did, even after being diagnosed, though falsely. He reminded himself sadly, it was simple and routine, and something anyone could do. Plus, he could help his parents. Lot of good that did him then. Yamada insisted Izuku let him, but if he was one thing, it was intelligent and stubborn, which may be great traits for a lawyer, but I'm gonna be a hero. Once plates were put away and the table whipped down, Yamada slipped into the pair's bedroom, presumably to change into his hero costume. The man in question had adamantly forbidden Izuku from going to school today. You need some well-deserved rest, he explained, calling the school to inform them of Izuku's absence. If the pros had anything to say on the principal's response, they didn't show it. Izuku was somewhat grateful. He didn't want to have the conversation about his quirkist education, not yet at least. Izuku wanted to ask Aizawa why he hadn't also gone to get ready, but the pro answered for him. I don't have a homeroom to teach this year, he explained, sitting down on the plush gray sofa, laptop booting up. Expelled the lot. They didn't show any potential, only cared about quirks and themselves. Realized this in a team exercise, where everyone gunned for themselves. He trailed, Izuku sitting next to him and wringing his hands together. He wanted to keep talking to Aizawa, learn about him. It's not every day you get to sit next to and talk to your favorite hero. Shaking his head, Izuku turned back to the pro. What was the exercise? He asked. Aizawa huffed to himself, suspiciously sounding like a laugh, as if he found the children's stupidity amusing. He probably did. It was a kind of secure the blank test. There were 3 devices and 6 teams. Half had the role of villains, the other heroes, which is a common hero course setup I might add. The heroes needed to detain it, villains needed to steal it. Point is, both sides had the same goal. They needed to secure 1 device per team, and make sure the opposing villain or heroes didn't get it. Sounds simple enough, Izuku said slowly, expecting it ended as anything but. It was simple. But instead of using teamwork to get the gems, and fight off the other 3 teams, every single student just boom went in, wanted to grab it for themselves. Now if it were their team's strategy, that's fine, but they started fighting amongst themselves, wanting to solo the activity completely. Eraser scoffed, slamming particularly HRD on the enter key, causing Izuku to jump before he let an amused snort escape. That earned Izuku a glare, but it quickly melted to an equally amused expression. Safe to say I would not be teaching them after that. Aizawa finished, and all Izuku could do was laugh. What a bunch of egotistical losers. Did they get kicked out? He asked after a few breaths, and Aizawa gave his head a short shake. Different homeroom teacher was assigned, but their record was permanently set with a UA expulsion mark, he explained, Izuku nodding along. Makes sense. They both quieted down after a bit, only stirring to wave Yamada goodbye, the blonde stealing a quick kiss before trotting out the door. A single click had the apartment quiet once again. Little sounds of the bustling city and happy birds filled the silence through the open window. Izuku relaxed into the couch, expecting to drift into a quick nap when he felt a soft mass against his arm. He flinched violently, whipping his head around to face Kitty. He exclaimed, eyes sparkling as the cat climbed into his lap. Without looking up from his laptop, Aizawa hummed, "His name's Duncan, but we call him Dusty, 'cause he looks like a little dust clump." Leaving Izuku to fall in love with the beauty, picking him up with a bright smile. "I would commit heinous accounts of federal crimes for him," he whispered, barely loud enough to hear, but earning an involuntary bark of laughter to erupt from the hero next to him. Izuku turned over in time to see an embarrassed flush hidden behind Aizawa's capture weapon, chuckling a bit himself. The comfortable silence continued, Izuku enjoying Dusty's company as he rested. He wanted to do some analysis, eager to jot up ideas surrounding his quirk. Sure, he'd thought about costumes, fighting styles, names, but now he had something to base it off of, a lead if you will. So before he could overthink, he slowly stood up, waiting to make sure Dusty was secure before sighing. He let Aizawa know he'd be heading to the room, almost tearing up when the pro corrected it to your room, and quickly circled the couch to slip inside. He left the door slightly ajar, in case Duncan wanted to leave, and took out his notebook, sitting at the small desk and booting up the laptop Yamada let him borrow. Apparently, he didn't need to bring it to UA, and made sure Izuku knew how to use it. After successfully opening the apps, he navigated to the search engine and began researching, multiple tabs open for what he'd need. He already knew what he would name his quirk, his hypothesis on the quirk's nature pushing his original label of eternal reincarnation to the top spot, but he paused. He technically didn't know it was eternal, it could have a limit or a buffer system. He tapped his fat gum pen against his chin, pondering a similar alternative. Unknown reincarnation. No, that sounded bad and was far too on the nose. Just reincarnation. Could work, but it was a bit too simple for Izuku's taste. After a long moment, Izuku came to a decision. He would name it Eternal Reincarnation, for two reasons only. One, it throws people off, and allows him a bit of deception in his general overpoweredness. Secondly, though he wouldn't dare admit it, he hoped the name would force manifest his quirk to cooperate that way. The thought of an unknown limit was unnerving, and though superstition was illogical scientifically, he wouldn't be where he is today if he weren't at least a bit spiritual. So he kept it, jotting down his choice and moving on to the rest. It would take a bit, but he had time. So, with Dusty settled in his lap and plenty of time to spare, he got to work. 0. Once the sky had long since passed its midday point, his clean quirk analysis was complete. He yawned, drained from the work as he stretched. The satisfying clicks of his bones earned him a smile, and a quick glance at the time informed him it was 3:47 p.m., jeepers. Around lunch, 𝐿𝐼 had called him out to eat, and they discussed the two pros' schedules quite a bit. He chuckled at the memory of lunch, amused how sandwiches were so hard to make. Aizawa had burnt the toast 3 separate times, and vegetables had rolled off the counter far too many to count, but they'd done it. Apparently, Yamada got home around 7. MIC co-hosted Put Your Hands Up Radio with a pro named Lost Boy. Izuku enjoyed the station no matter who hosted, and Lost Boy was certainly entertaining. His humor was always suspiciously young and hit quite well with the kids. He knew most older folks listening in preferred MIC his charisma fit for people of all ages, but Lost Boy had a special place in Izuku's heart. For one, the pro had a body covered in moss. Some people speculated his body had moss-based body hair, but Izuku had always known better. With simple digging, it was clear it reacted to the sun. Lost Boy's body most likely has the heightened qualities that surfaces in the forest held to be able to grow moss. It was one of the first full theories Izuku had developed, at the ripe age of 8, and was also his first theory to be confirmed. He'd been overjoyed when a caller had asked, and borderline ecstatic when the hero had confirmed he'd been right. He wished he could have been loud, but his parents were home and he didn't want them to leave for a hotel again. The last time that had happened was not very pleasant. Point is, he knew the general days Yamada would be home late, show days he logged off around 7:10, and the drive home was only about 15 minutes, so 7:30 was his usual leeway time when asked. He also learned that 𝐿𝐼 went in to teach the class he'd expelled twice a week, mandatory hero ethics replacing the 2 days of combat training. It was a humorous situation, but thankfully those 2 days were strictly Tuesdays and Wednesdays. Izuku was thankful it was Thursday today. He'd only need to go to school one more time before he had the weekend to relax. Petting and now sleeping Dusty, Izuku couldn't help his eyes glossing over, a soft, gentle smile setting on his lips. Even though he'd practically had his entire world flipped like a glass vase and shattered, through some miracle, it was getting put back together. An old art form came to mind, one of gold seals and broken pottery. The thought of fixing something broken, and making it into something wonderfully new. He didn't believe he'd ever be fixed, but he hoped no one would give up their efforts to try. Not too quickly at least. House reference stuff. Izuku's room replaces the storage area. Also Izuku's room design and fashion sense and stuff will also come later. Dinner was surprisingly uneventful, and the evening mellowed out the same. Aizawa had run him a bath, one he profusely thanked him for, and Yamada had even taken it upon himself to mend his uniform a bit, something he was once again adamantly grateful for. Yet settling into his bed, gosh, that's still so odd, he couldn't help but be upset. Anxiety and dread filled the crack between his bones, and justifiable exhaustion seemed to make its way over his body. He wanted to sleep, he did, but he was too tired to sleep. He wanted to laugh at himself at the thought, too tired to sleep, probably the most illogical thing Izuku had ever conjured up, but he was. He was grateful for his situation, happy he had a place he had unnaturally begun to already call home. Yet, he was so tired. Nothing had really changed in an overarching sense. He knew he was fine, knew he was going to be a hero, knew he'd make it, but nothing had outwardly been affected. To everyone else, he was still quirkless, useless, unevolved, and oh so very weak. He had never believed these things, but one little event on a secluded roof at 2 in the morning wasn't going to change anyone's minds. Only those who were there could have reason to believe in him. All in all, discovering his quirk wouldn't change anything at all, and it hurt. He was finally excited, realizing his goals were so much easier to achieve, and yet no one would see it that way. Maybe he had issues with validation. Maybe he thought being so open would get him better results. Maybe getting a dramatic reaction from others was his own way of validating horrible situations he could no longer connect to. You can't really blame him, can you? He didn't like how much he relied on this coping method. He certainly didn't like how it didn't protect him from people like Katsuki. Yet he couldn't help it. He'd put himself back together so many times, trying hard to seem okay, to not seem weak or useless. Yet he still wanted someone to help. All this effort into seeming fine, only to realize people won't try and fix something that looks perfectly fine. People are selfish and lazy, giving themselves as many reasons as they could to not find faults, to not be required to put in the effort, to fix, to work. People were selfish, but so was he. As he felt himself drift off, Izuku couldn't be bothered to wipe the warm liquid caught along the sides of his face and his neck, because tomorrow, he didn't know how he'd handle the day. Didn't want to know what he'd say, what he'd admit, how he'd explain anything that might happen to the pros who took him home. He knew he couldn't hide anything, knew his mind wouldn't let him. He knew it'd slip, that he'd immediately tell the heroes everything. The bullying, the discrimination, the pain. Most of all, he felt sick knowing he'd feel happy at the negative reaction he'd get from Aizawa and Yamada. He hated the thought. Hated himself. Hated how through the guilt of enjoying people's reactions, he still wanted someone to tell him he was perfect. Hold him and justify his misery, tell him what he's been through is horrible, that how he's treated is disgusting, that he had the right to be upset. He hated above all else, that even now, he depended on someone else's acceptance. Clawed at it. Craved it. Forced everything aside to get it. Sleeping should be a relief, but as he finally shuts his eyes, he could only feel empty, the same as the dreamless sleep he always got at night. Zero Izuku was relieved with how smooth morning seemed to go. Yamada had fixed them up a simple breakfast, rice and miso soup. Apparently they were out of meats, and even gave him enough time for a quick shower. Aizawa told him Yamada would be driving him to school, and after he thanked the two, he secretly let himself relax. He knew the two lived much further away from Aldera than the bridge. Speaking of Aldera, he hadn't even realized they were nearing the school until Yamada shook him out of his thoughts. What time does school end? He questioned in a tone that suggested he'd had to repeat himself. Izuku grimaced for not paying attention. 3:15. He answered, maneuvering his bag in the seat to allow an easier transition to his back. Yamada hummed, "Sho will probably have to pick you up, sorry in advance," the blonde said, a noticeable shiver running through his body. Should I be afraid?" he asked, and Yamada only gave him a look that could only mean run while you can. As the pro pulled up the entrance, the two stared at one another before they cracked, a string of unfiltered giggles filling the vehicle. "Alright kiddo, wait for Sho right here after school. If he doesn't see you I can't guarantee he won't waltz in to grab you himself," Yamada said as he climbed out, but Izuku didn't doubt the truth behind his laughter. "Will do," he chirped, saluting the pro before shutting the door. With a final wave, the hero was gone, and Izuku's face expertly morphed into the expressionless slate he'd grown accustomed to. He really hoped he wouldn't draw attention to himself today. He had a pretty nasty scar that dragged from his neck up to his cheekbones, and now that seemingly permanent injury was just gone. Ever the observant, Izuku quickly spotted where Katsuki and his SCK-ups were gathered. Listening closely, he tried to draw as little attention to himself as he could. "It was so boring when both you and Deku were gone yesterday," Izuku caught someone say. "Katsuki had missed school." "Yeah, but it was super cool how you fought against that sludge villain." Another shout. The same one Izuku had been targeted by. All Might had caught him though. Hadn't he? The explosive blonde scoffed, "I didn't need to even go to the hospital, only weaklings need to. I just went 'cause my mom told me to, and heroes don't make their moms worried." He bragged, and while that was true, it was amusing to see Katsuki so confident after an attack like that. If Izuku hadn't regenerated, he didn't doubt he'd have some lingering issues in his lungs. Thankfully, it seemed they caught whatever Katsuki had also got from the attack. Izuku could only assume it was some sort of organ suction. Having bits of human slime in your system is probably the opposite of healthy. When Katsuki made eye contact with him, he glared as usual, but it seemed less violent. Izuku wouldn't put money on that at all, but the blonde seemed almost pensive, thoughtful. Confused. He shook his head, took a breath, and walked through the yard. Only a few hours. He would survive. Probably. Zero. Not. Probably not. He was wrong. So very wrong. He would not survive. This was the day he died, he wouldn't be able to come back. Goodbye world. "Hey! Are you even listening, you DMN nerd?" Katsuki growled, a quirk-powered fist cracking the wall next to Izuku's head. Izuku nodded quickly, face remaining equally as blank as it was that morning. He didn't want to be here. Why had Katsuki dragged him out? Without his lackeys. Did he not want any witnesses? What was this even about? School was over, Aizawa would be waiting and then cause a scene trying to find him. The blonde hadn't said anything to Izuku all day. Was he waiting for something? Katsuki let out a horrific mix of a growl and a huff. Izuku could practically see the smoke filtering through his nostrils. "You better be, I own your pathetic attention. So listen closely, you disgusting nerd. What the FCK were you doing this morning here?" Oh. What had he done? He could usually form some sort of logical connection between his behavior and Katsuki's outburst, but not only had they basically not interacted at all today, but no one had. He'd sat where he was supposed to and did what he had to, nothing more, nothing less. So what had he done to give Katsuki his usual impression? Did the blonde develop a new irrational reason to believe his superiority is being challenged? Well, you speak when someone superior asks you a DMN question. He shouted, palms heating far too close to his head for Izuku's liking. "I don't know what I was doing, Kei-chan," he said, voice sweet as ever but as dull as his expressions had become. "You marking a fool out of me. Think you're better? That I wouldn't notice your fancy new car?" And who was the person driving? Auntie Inko finally gets a charity offer for her FCK up of a son. That how you could afford him? You're too much of a burden to deserve good SHT like that. It all makes sense. Of course, Katsuki would act this way. Izuku wished he could say, but now he was just even more confused. Wait here, Charity my mom. What are you dash another boom? Since you're too much of a useless more NSE bug, I'll spell it out for your pathetic ass. Where the FCK did you get a car? Haha, what? Izuku glanced down at his scarless skin, mended uniform, clean hair. Was Katsuki blind? He might as well be, considering his quirk could have caused Izuku issues with his eyesight, though he couldn't tell you what, he just knew something was wrong. So it was a logical assumption, but come on. Out of everything to notice, it was a class-related change. What 𝐷𝐶𝐾, that's what you noticed today? He scoffed, despite knowing he'd regret it, but overall too out of it to care. Of course Katsuki would pay attention to something material rather than the living person in front of him. Katsuki scowled so violently Izuku would almost worry his face would get stuck. The blonde reared his hands, palms burning red. The hell did you just say? Looking down on me, you quirkless waste of space. How dare you even think of speaking to your god that way? There's nothing else to notice on someone who's nothing. Izuku braced for impact, eyes squeezed shut and mind shut off. He didn't want to feel the searing burn, didn't want to hear the hurtful words, didn't want to feel the ache in his heart at what he heard. Izuku hated what Katsuki thought of him, he hated how broken he'd become from the world around him. Izuku hated that he couldn't save him. Yet, the burn didn't come. Instead of unbearable pain, he heard a strangled scream, clawing and struggling, all of which a tad too far to be near him, with a distinct lack of explosions. Cracking an eye open, his eyes trailed over a restrained Katsuki, strips of fabric holding him. Stuck between crying from relief and anxious at how the scene undoubtedly looks, he glanced towards a very angry Aizawa. Mind telling me how you got in this situation, you 𝐷𝐸 problem child? 0. 𝐿𝐴 wasn't expecting the kid to be where he was supposed to be, but it was still inconvenient. He really didn't want to be at this dump of a school longer than he had to, but alas, the universe had other plans. After finding a secure place to park, he walked up to the gates, promptly ignoring the strange looks from the middle school brats wandering about. He needed to find the kid. The sooner they got home, the sooner he could make himself a coffee, and the sooner he drank his coffee, the sooner he could go on patrol. Walking through the gates, his vigilance immediately spiked. If being an underground hero was good for many things, parental instincts aren't one he expected. Not that his complaining, the kid was adaptable, that's for sure. He glanced around, picking up on conversation, and he looked. He wished he hadn't. All across the yard, groups of spoiled middle schoolers talked amongst themselves about something that made 𝐿𝐴's stomach turn. Talk about Izuku, his kid, being dragged away by some swipe named Bakugo. Worst of all, he focused on a particular group, complaining how they weren't invited. The group laughed, and it took everything 𝐿𝐴 had to not commit several acts of premeditated murder that day. He instead stormed over to the group. Quirk active and a disappointingly low level of satisfaction along with the flinch from the kids. Where is Izuku? He didn't phrase it as a question, tone cold and hero license dangling loosely from his hand. If you don't cooperate, I have the right to make an arrest, choose your words wisely. Sure, it was harsh, but he had a thin temper and a kid to take home. Thankfully, it didn't take much convincing, and he barely stayed long enough for some kid with stretching fingers to point him away. He expected Izuku to be in a lot of situations, but about to be singed and beat was not one of them. He didn't give himself time to think before his quirk was active and the boy was restrained, thrashing and screaming like a rabid dog. What the FCK, mind telling me how you got in this situation, you 𝐷𝐸 problem child? He grits out, glaring daggers at the back of this Bakugo kid's head. I mean, Aizawa, I'm sorry I wasn't at the corner in time, but this really isn't what it looks like. He pleaded. Izuku was trembling, thin tears making a slow descent down his cheeks, yet he was worried about being late. On top of that, he seemed to be almost defending the basket case still firmly restrained in his capture weapon. He couldn't blame the poor kid. In his mind, he most likely thought that being late was worse than being assaulted behind a building. Still didn't make it right, or justifiable at all. That's not my issues, kid. Who the hell is this? 𝐿𝐴 said, deciding to leave the kid's mental state for a later date. Me. Who the FCK are you, old man? Some homeless geezer with a fabric quirk or some SHT? You can't use your quirk on a kid, especially not a kid better than you'll ever be. The kid was now glaring right at him, and 𝐿𝐴 wouldn't even be surprised if the kid began to foam at the mouth. So he glared right back. Actually, I can. I'm a pro hero, and I have a right to use my quirk against villains, he spat, feigning ignorance to the obvious flinch Izuku got at his words. The kid seemed even angrier, if that was possible, and didn't hesitate to activate his quirk at harmful levels when 𝐿𝐴 blinked. The pro quickly reactivated his quirk, as to not cause a scene and to prevent the kid from accidentally hurting himself, which he seemed almost blind to. 𝐿𝐴 caught sight of tender flesh where his quirk had undoubtedly burnt his wrists and arms. I'm not AF king villain, you moronic insignificant old BTSich. I'm going to be a hero, and I'm gonna be the king of all the pathetic wimps who call themselves heroes. Why you aren't even a pro, I've never heard of you. You have the king audacity to talk to me that way when there's a quirkless waste of air right there. He needs to be disposed of. The kid seemed to be working himself up to something detrimental. His breathing speed fluctuated at concerning levels, and he seemed to be almost choking on his own throat. Tears began to evaporate from his eyes, body temperature likely rising due to his quirk. 𝐿𝐴 needed to stop this, and fast. I'm an underground hero, it's my job to not be known by insignificant brats like you. Unlicensed quirk use and a fair number of assault charges, and likely permanent blacklisting from any hero school if Izuku asked. 𝐿𝐴 spat, choosing to ignore the blatantly horrible comment towards Izuku. He couldn't guarantee self-restraint, and society was generally discriminatory towards the quirkless even if Izuku wasn't, so he couldn't lash out at a child. The look of horror and practically statue-escape freeze of the kid was worth the bluntness if equally calming his breathing a bit. Why you can't do that? You're king lying. Actually Katsuki, he's not. The blonde kid, Katsuki, turned to Izuku. He seemed put off by the name for a sec before he exploded both literally and metaphorically, skin smoking with a foul stench and body trembling with a mixture of concerning emotion. What the FCK would a nobody like you know, Deku? You know nothing, you're worthless, useless beneath me. Disgusting. He spat, voice trembling and wet, saliva dripping from his panicked snarl. I know more than you do, Katsuki. The kid froze. 𝐿𝐴 could only assume he wasn't expecting talk back. Had Izuku just laid down for this monster in the past? I also know that he's in complete right to beat you up right now, and you could even get fined, or house arrest. Or something like that. Izuku said, tears and fear replaced with red-rimmed eyes and a quivering lip. As for Kane, well, he looked like he was 4 seconds from losing any hint of sanity remaining. What the hell? I'm supposed to be in charge. I'm better, I'm gonna be a god. Everyone says I'm the best, I'm supposed to put weaklings like you in your place. I'm allowed. Told me I was in charge. You can't hurt me, I'm the best. I'm better, I'm supposed to hurt you, I'm your ruler, your king, he chocked. Scratch that, Bakugo was having something 𝐿𝐴 would call a manic break. Though he wouldn't specify, he wasn't a therapist. Within a couple of seconds, it seemed this kid had lost it, tears and snot mixing down his face, drool dripping from panicked shouts and violent thrashing. His pupils seemed to dilate unnaturally and a crazed combination of chocked screaming and deep growling seemed to painful claw at his throat. Holy SHT. What the FCK did they tell this poor kid? Aizawa turned to a shaking Izuku, equally as terrified as the kid he was watching. Izuku! 𝐿𝐴 shouted, the boy's head snapping towards his own. A quick glance confirmed the blonde hadn't even heard. He seemed to be breaking even further. What started as being confused rambling devolved into structured praises towards himself, recited as prayers. Which was, wow, that was unhealthy. I'm going to need you to call Tsukochi with my phone, it's in my back pocket. Now. He shouted out the order, and Izuku, face set horror watching the blonde, noticeably swallowed as he nodded. Approaching the bro and shakily dialing the contact. He then addressed Bakugo, you aren't the best hero, and if you keep acting this way I doubt you ever will be, he said calmly. He needs the kid to understand, to hear, no matter how direct. With that, it didn't take long for this Katsuki kid to heave, vomiting everywhere as he screamed, his throat sounded painfully sore as he seemed to lose grasp on reality. What the hell was going on? Who caused this kid something like this? Thankfully 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 arrived sooner rather than later. Paramedics and a couple of officers in tow. 𝐼𝐼𝐲 had apparently joined them, and she quickly directed a pair of beetles, he assumed, to unclip Quirk's suppressant cuffs, and she delicately clipped them onto the now unconscious Katsuki. She seemed to send a strange bug 𝐿𝐴 had never seen to bite the kid's neck, instantly sedating him. Izuku protested, saying that weren't necessary, to treat him gently, but 𝐿𝐴 calmly explained. Not only were they there to keep those watching him safe, but they were equally meant to hinder any chance at him hurting himself. When Izuku regrettably complied, they followed 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 to their own car. Izuku wasn't required to go in for presumable questioning, but 𝐿𝐴 was, so he was still responsible for driving him back. As they walked, 𝐿𝐴 couldn't help but scowl. Someone, or multiple people, had practically brainwashed this kid into what could only be described as a self-destructive god complex. He felt so superior but cracked when that was put at risk. He couldn't handle even the implication he wasn't what he thought, and it was horrifying. He was still partially responsible, choosing his actions, but not nearly to the point 𝐿𝐴 had expected when he'd arrived at the school. He'd assumed the kid was a grade A bully, but now he was just a victim. Someone who needed to be saved from himself. Someone broke by society, just in a different way than Izuku. One kid suffered society's abuse, the other was dragged in, kicking and screaming, as an abuser, neither of their choice, both out of their control. They were stretched and ripped and torn so far, and 𝐿𝐴 didn't know what to do. He loathed people for their blatantly harmful biases, but there was almost nothing he could do. That wasn't going to change, but he hoped he wouldn't have to. Because just maybe, if he could pull these kids from the pit of horror and despair the world condemned them to, maybe they could do what he can't. He hoped, from the bottom of his tired, withering heart, that with a bit of hope, they could save what he failed to. That they could be true heroes. Before anything, however, they were the victims, they were broken. So, 𝐿𝐴 was going to save them. He was a hero, after all. In short, Izuku was in shock. He had never dreamed of seeing Katsuki in such a state. It was painful. He looked so incredibly broken, more so than Izuku had ever been himself. It scared him to see someone who claimed to be so strong, down at their lowest. Someone he'd known and regrettably cared about. Izuku wasn't blind to the blonde's mental state, and far from simply aware of his own. He knew it was incredibly illogical to deny something as harmful and blaring as mental health, especially his own. He knew he had heavy repercussions from his childhood, the streets, school, everything. He wasn't an idiot. All in all, recognizing he wasn't okay was already putting him in a much better place, knowing when he needed to step back or ask for help. Katsuki didn't have that privilege. Izuku wanted his friend back, but didn't know if that was even possible anymore. Leaving the kid at home was hard. Hisashi was there, of course, but it still wasn't pleasant to leave. Izuku was completely out of it, and it was a challenge for 𝐿𝐴 to just go while the kid clung onto Zashi like a lifeline. They were huddled under a pile of blankets, and the one family member with constant exhaustion was of course the one to go in to question an unstable minor. Because of course. 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 was already parked outside. His driving was only accepted because Izuku was too out of it to notice the Mario Kart levels of driving. He groaned, climbing through the door and crossing his arms with a huff, ignoring the sympathetic look his friend gave him. No need to get all huffy, this is for those kids, we have to help them, right? 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 asked, earning a glare from 𝐿𝐴 before his head buried into his capture weapon. Well, you don't need to pout about it, the detective chuckled, the mood lighting ever so slightly. "I'm not pouting," 𝐿𝐴 groaned, watching as a few street lamps began to flicker to life. Sure, another chuckle. The precinct was in view, and 𝐿𝐴 could already tell he was in for a headache. If the shrill screams of an angry woman that hit the two once they'd stepped out of the car were any indication, this would be hell. They walked in to see a very aggressive woman with familiar spiked blonde hair and matching scowl. She was being held gently back by a man with a bit softer-looking spiky brown hair, trying to simultaneously calm his presumed wife down while apologizing to 𝐒𝐴𝐽 at the desk. "What seems to be the issue now?" 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 asked, voice laced with melted honey as he did to de-escalate. The one turned on him, fury almost visually bubbling beneath her skin. "You idiots arrested my kid." She spat, waving a finger to the detective. "That we did, are you aware as to why?" He said, as sugar-sweet as he could get it. "There shouldn't be a reason. My Katsuki is perfect, the kid's got a strong quirk and the makings of a hero, you can't be throwing something so perfect around in a dirty shell." She fumed and Shouter understood now. "Miss, your son is being taken in for assaulting a classmate and illegal quirk use. Unless you want him sent straight to a child prison without further investigation, you'll come in for his questioning." Shouter said coldly, silencing her rage and freezing her in place. A look of bafflement spread across her face as her husband apologized violently to Hayami, who continued to wave him off and offer him a small chocolate. Shouter nodded and walked straight to the interrogation room. This would be a very long evening and he wouldn't be doing more than the bare minimum of his job, even if he wanted to get this kid sent far away from Izuku until he got the help he needed. Izuku was doing a bit better now, he'd say. After the impromptu cuddle session with Yamada, he'd been incredibly flustered and awkward. Sure, they'd be living together, and the guy wasn't exactly the most hero-looking off the job, but he was still present MIC. That knowledge only fueled poor Izuku's head with disbelief. Oh well. Yamada had made them a steaming pot of fresh beef stew, the smell of simmering meat and potatoes and an abundance of spice was lovely. The cooking piari gave Izuku time to do his homework, Yamada holding an easy, distracting conversation. Which Izuku was grateful for. After they'd eaten, the sun had just about set, and Izuku was debating what to do. "How about a walk?" Yamada piped up, snapping Izuku from his debate. "That'd be nice, yeah," he smiled, standing up to grab the offered coat, which was a lovely beige with big brown buttons, and a bow waist tie. It was very lovely and fit perfectly, had they bought this for him. "Where'll we go?" "Who knows, I'd say I'd let you choose, but there are plenty of food stalls along my usual route so it should be fine," Yamada hums, voice significantly calmer than usual. It was nice. The pro adorned a green corduroy jacket, embroidered with colorful flowers along the sleeves and base of the fabric. The blonde had paired it with what he had already been wearing, which Izuku couldn't help but find lovely on him. A baby white top with yellow sunflowers along the hems, and baggy yellow breathes with brown stripes. Izuku couldn't say the house's look was much of a surprise anymore, considering the particular way Yamada dresses. Izuku felt a bit silly in his black sweats and white t-shirt, but the lovely coat made him feel much better. He didn't realize the look was something he'd be entirely fond of, but it really was quite cute. Yamada led them out, chilly evening air hitting Izuku's face and ruffling his hair. The movement caught the blonde's attention, and he let out a questioning hum. "Something wrong?" Izuku asks, tilting his head to the side as they walk. "Oh, nothing, lil listener, just curious what the story behind this is," he said, gesturing gently to the singed hair on the underside of Izuku's scalp. "Oh, long story actually, you know the kid Aizawa's dealing with. Well, he's a childhood friend of mine, I guess you could say. After developing a quirk he got different. His mom wasn't any help, despite generally being nice to people. She really didn't help his development. He became violent, I guess. This was from a while ago. Before I died a few days ago, I had this gnarly scar on the back of my neck, and my hair, and its roots, got like super damaged. It won't regrow, so I'm stuck with good old crispy locks," he chuckled, telling the story as it was. Yamada pouted, "That's horrible. Who'd do such a thing to someone as sweet as you?" "Ooh." The hero scoffed again, throwing his hands up. Izuku giggled. "You're funny, I know," Yamada said, flicking his hair dramatically as the two laughed. A comfortable silence fell over the two and continued to remain nice as they bought crepes from a street stall. Sitting down at a park bench, Izuku couldn't help but notice Yamada had opted for the girl crepe paper, holding it loosely as he ate. Of course, gender was a construct, but the stall itself had 3 paper options: boy, girl, and enchanted. Which in hindsight was pretty funny, but did nothing to stop Izuku from his curious bluntness. "You got the girl paper?" Izuku asked, wincing at the lackluster phrasing, "and not that it's a bad thing. You can like whatever paper you want because gender isn't real and it's a cute paper and it's not a big deal. I was just curious, so it and 𝐂𝐭𝐚𝐲 cut him off with a gentle laugh. I just like the girlier things, but to answer your hidden question, I'm non-binary, he explained, attracting Izuku's undivided attention, well, non-binary male. I still use he, him pronouns and whatnot, but other than that I like stereotypically feminine clothes and activities, and really don't have a preference when it comes to honorifics or compliments. He explained calmly, grinning happily at the wonder in Izuku's eyes. That's really incredible. Wow, that explains your amazing fashion sense now. Would you want me to call you Mrs. or Sir? Gah, this is so fun. He bounced, practically radiating excitement. Glad you think so, kiddo. Really he wasn't particularly worried the boy was homophobic, but it's trained anxiety. So minimal relief was still present. I do. It's amazing to see so many 𝐻 heroes I never knew about. It makes me so happy, he smiled, and oh, Hisashi needed to look into that. No kid of his would be allowed internalized homophobia if that was what it was, but he decided not to press. Well, there's plenty more than just me and show, but it's not exactly my place to say, he chuckled, taking another bite of his crepe. Of course. I would never ever ask you to reveal something like that about someone else and out them to a kid, oh my gosh. Hisashi just ruffled Izuku's hair, good on you kiddo, and they ate in silence until it was time to head home. The walk was peaceful. The air was still but crisp, and the stars seemed even brighter despite the street lamps. It was really nice, though the blonde noticed Izuku's anxious fidgeting, and assumed he mustn't have felt that way. Something on your mind, little listener? He pressed. Izuku perked up, wide viridian eyes reflecting the lamps as he searched for something in the prose features. He took a breath, shutting his eyes tight enough to appear painful. I know you're just housing me for the time being, and that it's already a super bunch to be grateful for because no one's ever treated me so nice and it's really an honor, but I mean so. If it's not too much of a selfish question, do you think words seemed to catch in the boy's throat, face settling into frustrated confusion. Take your time kiddo, Hisashi said gently. Izuku nodded, taking another deep breath before staring daggers into Hisashi's similarly green eyes. Do you think it's possible for me to become a hero even with a quirk like this? He asked, and though he had a look that screamed I want an honest answer, his trembling palms and quivering lower lip made his insecurities all too clear. With the boy growing up quirkless, Hisashi couldn't help but understand far too clearly. Without a second thought, he squatted down to grab Izuku's trembling hands, rubbing freckled skin as he got the boy's attention and boy. Meeting the boy's almost pleading expression, eyes filled with hope and plagued by unshed tears, Hisashi softened even further, settling back against his heels to give the boy a look he'd save only for show and little kids at rescue locations. Because he was going to help Izuku, just as if he were any other kid. The only difference was that this was his kid. If it's you, little listener, you'll be the best hero Japan, the world has ever seen, he said, voice filled with honesty, and it was worth it. Warm, hot tears began streaming down Izuku's face, a smile so small, so real it hurt to see. He'd likely had his dreams crushed beyond repair, and even if Hisashi hadn't thought the quirk could help, his kid would find a way. He and 𝐿𝐿 would find a way. Izuku will be a hero. Izuku choked, voice breaking as he sobbed, loud and raw. He rammed into Hisashi, arms wrapped so tight around the blonde he'd be afraid of breaking if the kid wasn't so frail. Hisashi wouldn't admit to the kid that his weight was a massive concern. Hisashi returned the embrace, hands carding gently through green tufts, whispering gently to the boy pressed against his shoulder. He hurt to see him so vulnerable, so broken. This boy was a gift from the world, a masterpiece forged by the gods, with a heart too pure, and a will so strong. Izuku was far too precious, too selfless, to believe his worth was so small. Fragility seeped from his crack, gold seals not yet mending his broken soul. Hisashi hurt for his child. Don't cry. He choked, hypocritical tears streaming down his pale face. You're perfect. Hisashi's style, the entire situation with the Bakugus was terrifying. 𝐿𝐿 didn't know whether to strangle the woman or knock out the kid. Bakugu's dad was a sweet man, how he dealt with this was truly a mystery. Though, their dynamic wasn't what concerned 𝐿𝐿, No, it was this woman's 𝐒𝐻𝐻 way of talking about her kid. Which showed all too clearly how his trash fire of a personality was encouraged. She talked about her son as if he was some sort of king, allowed to do as he pleased simply based on some superiority hierarchy she planted in his head. Interjecting when he was asked vulnerable questions, and shouting when they weren't worthy of his answers. The kid only looked smug in those moments, sensitive questions about his health being met with a "his perfect" or "why does that matter?" His mom fed him his god complex on a golden spoon and he believed every word. Honestly, it made 𝐻𝐿 sick. The final straw, however, was the violence. When Katsuki would begin to crack, head jumbled with what right or wrong way, she'd snap. Violent hits to the back of his head, accompanied by words phrased with derogatory venom, and what seemed to be an almost trained reaction erupted through Katsuki's angry shouts and fuming remarks. Around the third time it happened, 𝐻𝐿 lost it, waiting for only the bare minimum of permission to drag the women away. Worst of all, her husband didn't even protest, exiting with rushed apologies as he followed his wife. It was a painful dynamic, one that was affecting Katsuki much more than originally anticipated. The situation solidified to a few main concerns, and through many protests, a course of action was decided for the blonde. 𝐻𝐿 just hoped it was the right one. Izuku and Yamada had arrived back home at the apartment a while ago. Now they were waiting for Aizawa to get home. Apparently, he'd sent Yamada a text a bit ago, informing them that he'd be a bit longer, since more and more things kept coming up, as he put it. Frankly, Izuku wasn't surprised in the slightest. Katsuki's mental state was far from healthy, and he couldn't help but feel relieved the boy was getting help. After an hour or so, Izuku excused himself to his room, Dusty deciding to follow along. Shutting the door gently, he sunk into the white sheets. Yamada said tomorrow they'd be going to get him things. Izuku wanted to protest, but in hindsight, the blonde's idea was only logical. If Izuku was going to stay here with them until he was old enough to be without guardians, decorating his room would be a way for the adults to make him feel comfortable in the space because they certainly wouldn't have offered to take him in if they didn't want him there. Clothing was a bit baffling, but really, looking at Izuku's only shirt, it was understandable. Izuku rolled, flopping around the sheets until his stomach was laying snug against the sheets. Feeling warm paws against his upper thighs, he chuckled, feeling Dusty settle in the swell of his back. "Comfy?" he asked, a whisper of his usual volume. A low purr was his only response. "I'm glad," he hummed. "You're lucky, bud, you don't have to worry about literally anything," that earned a comforting tail flick. He decided to keep his basically one-sided conversation. "Do you think 𝐂𝐲-chan will be alright?" he mused. It's always been odd referring to him as Katsuki in his head. Sure, he deduced it was for the best, finding the terribly found nickname too painful to think about, with the way Katsuki is now, but it still felt off. Katsuki was 𝐂𝐲-chan, and before everything, Izuku was Zuku. He smiled at the thought, trying to imagine Katsuki calling him by the name now. It didn't really work, but it was nice to think about. Dusty nudged his shoulder blade, presumably wishing to continue their highly intelligent discussion. Sorry, just thinking. You know," he said, lifting his head to prop his chin against the palms of his hands, "it's so weird to think about what's been happening. I mean, 𝐂𝐲-chan was arrested for Kami's sake. That's definitely not how I was expecting my Friday to go." He laughed at his own joke. "Gee, how sad." Dusty let out a shocked meow as if feigning his own disbelief. "At least someone is as shocked as I seem to be. Right. Absolutely crazy. And then Yamada took me out for crepes. Crepes? I haven't been out to get stall food in like literally ever. He was so nice about it too." Then Izuku felt his throat tighten, choking back a heavy lump. "He told me I could be a hero," he said, feeling the telltale signs of a single tear running slowly down his cheek and settling just under his chin. The grounding weight against his back lifted, along with his head, being pushed up by soft fur. He sat back, legs crossed at the ankles, fluffy gray in his lap. "So oi. I don't know what got into me the Izuku stuttered, choking out the final syllable as big wet tears ran down his face, clogging his words as he quietly wailed. Incoherent babbles of "someone believes in me" and "he says I'm a hero" blended together as he wrapped his arms around the warm mass in his lap, thankful Dusty had taken the initiative to settle close. He said could do it? That I could do anything." Izuku choked out, unfamiliar warmth wrapping around his chest, burning his heart like red-hot chains, filling his lungs with thin smoke. He felt like he was dying, but it wasn't bad. He'd felt burns, bright sparks flashing across his vision, searing burns littering his skin, blistering the flesh, and filling his nose with the vile smell. This hurt, but it wasn't terrifying. He didn't want to scream or run, begging for mercy. He knew this feeling hurt, but it didn't scare him, almost a comforting presence. As if it was a precursor to incomprehensible positivity. He stayed there, feeling held in his arms as he wailed, comforting purrs and rubs soothing his burning skin. He couldn't tell you how long they stayed like that, and if he held Dusty tightly against his chest as sleep took him, he couldn't say. Tiring yourself out was a funny feeling, emotional exhaustion feeling like a violently dragging pull down into the world of dreams. He needed the rest, though since Duncan hadn't left, he probably did too. If he missed Aizawa coming home, well, there was always tomorrow morning, he supposes. He supposed correctly, waking up to the smell of coffee once again. The morning was peaceful but tense, information being shared throughout breakfast and into the getting ready period of the day, and boy was there a lot of information. To start, they began with 𝐂𝐻, because the situation ran far deeper than even Izuku expected. Izuku knew the boy's personality wasn't the best. Even before they'd gotten their quirks, he'd had a disgustingly large ego and a nasty temper. On top of being disrespectful and outright rude at times, his mother seems to hold him on a pedestal. He was her golden boy, and could seemingly do no wrong. Izuku knew she liked him, that was no surprise. The only instance she'd ever turn on her son was when Izuku was involved. "Look, Izuku ate his whole dinner." She'd snap, calling Katsuki spoiled despite the fact she was the one spoiling. It didn't hurt that Izuku barely had enough food to feed himself at home, but he'd never tell Auntie Mitsuki that. He just sat quietly and used his manners, while 𝐂𝐻 threw a fit. Though that was when he'd only recently been diagnosed quirkless, nothing official with his whole mutant-type gene. Overall, it seemed Katsuki only took the adult's favoritism and bias to further his own dumb means, using their ignorance to justify clearly unheroic behavior. All in all, Katsuki wasn't the brightest or the nicest, but he was still a kid. Sure, the adults didn't really make his hostility any better, but they certainly didn't make it worse. If anything, they made him showier, less likely to hurt Izuku or others on his own time. No, Katsuki was bad, but he was a kid, and kids can learn to be better. Even if he likely didn't want to. He was messed up and full of images of his own self that were far too grand to be healthy when they inevitably shatter. Izuku felt hurt imagining those fragments, hissing at the thought of each unattainable goal digging into Katsuki's ever-ticking bomb. Thankfully, there was a perfect solution, though Auntie Mitsuki wouldn't see it that way. Katsuki had to be held in a hospital, a psychological one. Izuku used to be scared of those places, movies, and dramatic teenagers telling not-so-accurate horror stories. Though from what Aizawa explained, it didn't seem so bad. He'd stay there for quite some time, about 5 months. Although Izuku found almost half an entire year to be quite a while, he reasoned that Katsuki was still required to do schoolwork, and was given ample time to take high school exams. Once released, he'd be staying with a pro-hero to monitor his behavior. This would last until around halfway through their second term of school, around May. He'd then be sent back to his parents or to a home. Speaking of his parents, the couple in question were also required to do intensive therapy, as well as charging Auntie Mitsuki to extensive house arrest, until a professional deems her fit to deal with her temper alone. Which thankfully won't interfere with either adult's work. Being fashion designers, she'll only need to move her station home, and find a way to send her concepts to the creative teams. Her abuse was only really given such a harsh punishment at Hayami-san's request. Izuku had only met her briefly, joining them in the car ride home, and she was what Izuku would say one of the most motherly feeling people he knew. She was outgoing and chipper, a boisterous and deep voice not matching her far below average frame. She was also rather aggressively caring, practically beating Aizawa with a water bottle to hand Izuku after finding out he was dehydrated. He'd asked Yamada about the women during their cuddle, learning about her quirk causing him to almost buzz with questions. Was it voice-activated? Did she have to see the insect to make it work? How extensive can the commands go? Can she actually speak and communicate? Or are there other methods to use them? Could she eavesdrop on interrogations? Spy on drag rings through the bug's eyes? More than her quirk, however, he learned of her child. A young girl, around Izuku's age. Her name was Hayami Ishigo, and she had a rather potent mutant quirk of Firefly 1 to be exact. She also had a son, Hitoshi Shinsu. Apparently, he was only her stepchild, but the way Yamada described her and her wife's relationship, it didn't really seem as if she'd been remarried. They beat out Yamada and Aizawa's snappiness by a landslide. According to Yamada's stories, Hayami Akane could only be described as a mama bear. Both Izuku and the blonde shivered at a retelling of a bully story. Kori Shinsu needed to explain why her wife, a well-respected cop, almost hospitalized a child. In the end, the red-haired cop's decision was finalized. It was a surprisingly logical conclusion, lasting a while and with ample aid to every party involved. Even if Izuku was still worried about his kind of friend and how he'd take to the ward, as for Izuku, he'd be transferred out of Aldera, as per both pros' requests. Thankfully, it was early in the term, so it'd be relatively easy. Being pros would speed up the process, finalizing the transfer by Wednesday. Izuku was bummed about missing school for 2 days, but he supposed there wouldn't be a school to miss with the transfer. That discussion, however, needed to wait. Yamada was ecstatic about furnishing and decided any large aspects of the bedroom would be done online, before moving to malls for decorations and clothing. Izuku found it hard not to humble his generosity but managed to hold his own against the blonde's spoiling nature. 0. Overall, he was rather pleased with the purchases made. For his bed, he chose an off-white spread, browns, and beiges mixed into the various pillows and added blankets, the final duvet having thin graph-like lines. According to Yamada, resident fashion nerd, he seemed drawn to things in a stereotypically light academia-styled things. He nodded along enthusiastically, both he and the blonde choosing to ignore Aizawa's grumbling disinterest. Apparently the only reason the man dressed with any semblance of coordination was due to his husband. He picked out a few decorations that caught his eye and settled for a rosy brown tint for the furniture wood. After everything was ordered, Yamada dragged the household out for some shopping. Izuku was excited, but that quickly devolved to slightly overwhelming amusement. Yamada was all over the place, buying almost anything Izuku showed interest in, only stopping when Izuku promised to let him know when he actually wanted something so he wouldn't buy half the mall. Apparently, this was what the number 2 internet media hero did with his savings. Who'd have thought? Izuku took quite a liking to the beiges and browns once again, shocker. Keeping in mind Yamada's examples of light academia, Izuku naturally felt drawn to collared shirts and big earthy-toned crew-neck sweaters. Corduroy and lined briefs were added to their bags, along with various sweater vests and a lovely lined beige scarf. As for shoes, he chose to buy another pair of his favorite reds, but agreed to the various pairs of loafers and dress shoes to match his look. Finally, they'd finished. Izuku finalizes their trip with a dried flower garland from a quaint occult shop in the far corner of the mall. Yamada complained he was hungry and insisted Izuku needed to be fed. So, begrudgingly on Aizawa's part, the three were dragged to an American-style 80s dinner, choosing a booth seat with a clear sight of any and all exists, no blind spots are the life of a hero. They began chatting with Izuku. Izuku was overly grateful and thanked the pros for every item he'd gotten individually. There is one more thing, though, Yamada said, seeming to avoid Izuku's eyes. The blonde was fidgeting nervously, and on closer inspection, the raven next to him was similarly anxious, if tense shoulders were any tell. Izuku felt his own nerves spike, catching in his throat as he nodded. What do you need? He asked. It was illogical to worry about being left behind, that they bought all this to send him off to his own rundown apartment, but he couldn't help the underlying trauma. The school we want to transfer you to. It's really strict, attempting to keep students safe and all that you know. So the school has a strict enrolling policy because they're strict, so they need to keep things strict, and like dash the blonde's familiar anxious rambling was interrupted, 𝐼𝐻𝐼 butting in. What Zachy is trying to say is that the school has specific requirements when enrolling, that include guardianship. Izuku held his breath. Were they gonna give him up? Send him to a home? Make him move with his new things? It doesn't make sense, but emotionally. Which means we have limited choices. So we were wondering, would you want us to adopt you? Here. Izuku style, adopt dash. If a human being had the ability to turn into a blue screen, Xiaota would bet a lot of money Izuku would be the first. It's a bit more complicated than that. Xiaota sighed. The school we dash and Tsukochi. Hisashi squeaked, nerves almost visually burning. Yes, the school we and the detective chose has a system in place for certain children. Those with mental health issues or learning disabilities. Really, we only chose it because Hayami-san's wife runs the daycare there, but it's pretty tightly run. He said. It's got a super sweet working environment for little listeners who are a bit rougher around the emotional edges, you know. Hisashi added, clearly slipping into a showy persona to mask his anxieties. Xiaota couldn't help the gentle hand he placed on his husband's thigh. He knew Zachy would be nervous about this conversation but didn't realize to what extent. He gently rubbed his thumb against the soft pink fabric of his skirt. If you remember about Hayami-san's kids, they also attend, and her wife works in the daycare section of the school, the blonde added. We super duper trust them to take care of you. Xiaota continued, of course, if you don't want to be adopted by two random pro heroes, that's fine too. We could always just file permanent guardianship until you reach adulthood. However, he allowed Hisashi to continue. We've actually been wanting to adopt, his husband breathed, running painted nails through his hair, and we figured, well. You fit the situation so well, and you're such a great kid, he continued, voice becoming gradually small. You already fit so well in our home. The boy's mind seemed to be running a mile a minute. Of course, in Xiaota's eyes, this whole situation was optimally convenient, and overall made sense from an emotional point of view. However, they were dealing with a kid, one that had an ample amount of trauma and insecurities. Izuku choked, taking his time to answer. They let him sort through his thoughts. You both actually want me? The two instantly softened at his shaking. We've always wanted a boy like you. 0. If Izuku hadn't been consistently counting his fingers, he'd be convinced he'd slipped into a realistic dream. If you thought about their offer solely through convenience, they would have simply filled permanent guardianship as they mentioned, making the process easier without unnecessary responsibilities and paperwork, while also filling the school's criteria. Yet they hadn't, they wanted him. If Izuku hadn't learned to read people so well, he would have assumed they were bluffing, but there just wasn't a logical explanation for any possible deception. I don't understand. He admitted, the stinging of tears at the back of his eyes refusing to fall. It wasn't something to cry over. I mean, you could have just done the guardianship thing and not had to dash. We didn't have to. You're right, Aizawa said, firm hand placed against his own, and freckles standing out against pale callus. But we want to, he said firmly, and a quick glance at Yamada's violent nodding was such an in-character form of agreement. Izuku let a wet laugh bubble from his chest, slipping his hands away to press still shaking palms into his eyes. He nodded, so small, so frail, as if he was still worried it was a practical joke. Despite the fact that was illogical, Yamada seemed to practically light up, practically jumping over the table in his haste to round it, wrapping Izuku in deceptively strong arms. He seemed to be crying more than the shorter was. Aizawa took more time, a gentle smile against his lips. Izuku was positive he'd been one of the only people to see the man so soft, but as he wrapped gently arms around his husband's back, carding rough hand through Izuku's hair, he couldn't say he minded. You're ours. Our boy now. Yamada sobbed, earning a fond chuckle from the man behind him. Not yet, but he will be, Aizawa said, earning a genuine laugh from the whole group. There they stayed until a clearly confused teen cleared his throat. In a pit of embarrassment, the three ordered their food, Yamada insisting the waiter brought them extra milkshakes. To celebrate, he'd said. 𝐒𝐿, however, was far more interested in the guy's hair. A black bolt that seemed almost natural ran through his vibrant blonde, and when he'd laced their food on the table, a small shock had run through 𝐒𝐿's arm at the contact. "Sorry, bro," the waiter exclaimed, a sheepish smile spreading across his face. "It's no problem at all. Do you have an electricity quirk?" 𝐒𝐿 asked, stars in his eyes once again. The boy was visually startled, before a million-watt smile overtook his face. I do. I guess it's kind of obvious here." 𝐒𝐿 had to swallow an unfamiliar lump in his throat. Why was his smile so nice? 𝐒𝐿 nodded, bushy curls bouncing across his head. "It is. Is the stripe natural or did you add it? If it's natural, did it only show up when your quirk did? Can you just direct electricity or do you produce it? Are you conductive or does it hurt you? How do you fare in water?" 𝐒𝐿 shut his mouth, realizing he was practically interrogating the poor waiter. However, to his surprise. "Wow, so many questions. Okay, so the stripe is natural, but it's more of a family thing, so I've always had it. I can make my whole body spark up and distribute it, but I guess my voltage limit goes too high, my brain gets fried and I go kind of stupid," he said, face visually dropping at the comment. "So I guess it does kind of hurt me. But I am conductive, and yeah, activating my quirk in water isn't exactly the best idea," he laughed. 𝐒𝐿 only spared a quick glance at the pro's shocked expressions, his own bafflement at the boy's ability to keep up quickly overshadowed by his quirk-induced interest. "That's incredible that you know so much. But getting your brain to hurt like that probably isn't entirely smart. There's probably a reason, and logically just sending out a voltage doesn't seem all that possible. I'm almost positive there's more to it than that, as well as the side effects themselves." He trailed off, mumbling an excess amount of in-depth theories and ideas, even barely catching what he was saying. "Wow dude, you're like, super freaking smart. That's so cool. Smart guys are like totally my type," he winked, sending 𝐒𝐿 out of his head with a furious blush. He stumbled, quickly taking a long sip from his milkshake as he glanced towards the pros for help. If their amused avoidance of eye contact was anything, they found this amusing. "Traitors. The blonde interjected, "My name's Denki Kaminari if you were wondering," he supplied, nervously shaking his wrist to his side. If Yamada caught onto the stim, he wouldn't say, "I'm 𝐒𝐿 Midoriya, but please call me 𝐒𝐿," he smiled, getting his bearings back at the normal conversation. "Cool. Then you can call me Denki. Man, if I had any of this help when my quirk came in, maybe I wouldn't be so dumb," he trailed, zoning out before a quick smile relaced the mellow expression. 𝐒𝐿 paused. He wasn't exactly sure what he was or wasn't allowed to do. Yamada had got him a simple phone, and Aizawa had said he could do what he pleased, so. I don't know if this is overstepping, but he glanced towards the curious adults across from him. "If I got your number, we could find a time to meet up and maybe talk about your quirk." He offered a nervous smile, quirking the corners of his mouth. It was the blonde's turn to blush, bright red spreading across his cheeks as a small spark zapped in the corner of his eye. Yeah, that'd be cool," he drawled, grabbing his order sticky pad to furiously scribble his number down and hand it to 𝐒𝐿. Here, he smiled sheepishly, sparing a quick glance to the adults before saluting. "Gotta get back to work. Later 𝐒𝐿," he said hastily, stumbling away. A beat of silence later, and Yamada was wiggling his eyebrow at 𝐒𝐿 with a smug look. "Shush," 𝐒𝐿 whined, ignoring any and all questions by eating his share of food. After that experience, the trio headed home. It took quite some time to set up the spare room with 𝐒𝐿's things. The furniture they ordered arrived quickly due to the hero's delivery service, which, why did that even exist? 𝐒𝐿 insisted on putting his own things away, organization a top priority, and he had a bit of anxiety when it came to the layout of his space. Once that was finished, lunch had long since digested, and Yamada had simply reheated last night's curry. Aizawa has insisted they watch an action-packed pre-quirk movie marathon as they ate, sending them all off to bed after the final installation to the series concluded. Throughout the movie, they discussed certain things, like paperwork and whatnot. Apparently, they could speed up the acceptance process with help from the police and UA's principal, which 𝐒𝐿 definitely didn't fanboy over, and they'd be allowed to enroll him by Wednesday. He'd attend 2 days for Thursday and Friday to get settled, and then officially begin this term on Monday. Additionally, he'd need to learn more about his quirk, as well as a full psychological exam. This was regrettably from Aizawa, it seemed, going to be handled by Principal Nezu, which again Izuku totally didn't fanboy over. The raven-haired pro also explained they'd expect him to attend therapy, Yue's own school counselor being the one they recommended. Izuku knew why they were shocked at his quick acceptance, and quickly explained it was only logical he'd require psychological aid. They both seemed much more relaxed after that talk. After heading off to bed, Izuku couldn't help the wide smile across his face, running a gentle hand through Dusty's fur. "They're family now," he said, chuckling at the cat's affectionate purr. "You are too." He cheered. He drifted to warm purring and a brand new room, the comfort he was confident would last him his lifetime. Izuku's room plus phone cause it's relevant. The next few days were hectic, and that was Izuku putting it lightly. The whole family was rushing through paperwork and preparations, and things continued to pile before abruptly being pulled from under once completed. Izuku wasn't exactly complaining, he was grateful, but it became a lot. On the plus side, today was his first day of school, it was pretty much the end of their first term, so he was only going to be given busy work and a generalized test at the end instead of his exams. After it'll be second and third term, exams in the later, and then summer. Then, he'd hopefully be off to UA. He was excited to head back to school, always eager to learn. On top of that, his usual teach-related anxieties were slightly subsided due to no longer being officially registered as quirkless on paper. As for friendships and classmates, he couldn't really say he was all that worried either. Yamada had promised Izuku that Hayami-san's kids were there, and he'd even had a few pleasant conversations with her daughter, after the two families shared contacts for safety. She'd kind of refused to talk about her or her brother's quirk over text, and though Izuku was disappointed, when she explained he softened. Her brother was bullied and respectfully, she was equally as much of a quirk nerd as he was. When she said the text box character limit was a hindrance to her properly describing things, Izuku had never connected to someone more spiritually. He'd also been talking with Cam Denki quite a bit over the past few days, and they'd both learned an equal amount about one another. Apparently, Denki lived relatively alone, his mom being a pro-hero and all Izuku gushed about her for quite some time, completely blocking out the irrational pride he felt at the realization that he also technically had pro-hero parents now. Two of them. He used he/it pronouns, loved any and all fashion trends, was open about his ADHD, and had a pet lizard named The Rock, after a relatively popular American hero. He apparently started out in professional quirk brawls but became much more mainstream after he began acting. With his quirk being so similar to All Might's, he'd chosen to research a new strength-type hero to call a favorite. And he also had a small wonky lightning scar on his back from when his quirk developed. They were on call when he'd told Izuku, but before the boy could begin to fret, Denki chose to clarify. His mom also had an electricity quirk, and when his had developed, he'd been unlucky enough to be sitting on the edge of some rail-less stairs at her agency. He'd made a particularly large shock against the metal, frightening him and causing him to fall. In full Mama Bear mode, his mother had caught him, but their compatible charges accidentally activated her quirk. Since it came from the nails, there were a few scratches that blossomed into electric lines where she'd hugged the falling boy into her arms. Izuku was enraptured by the story, and well, sue him if he was staring a little too closely at the boy's oddly toned back when he'd shown the marks. For the record, no, he was not flustered when Denki had pointed out his lingering gaze. On the plus side, the blonde seemed equally as invested in Izuku's own stories. He opted to leave out the "I used to be quirkless but then after I found out the number one hero was a quirkist bigot and crushed my dreams and killed myself I found out I wasn't quirkless," but did end up explaining his old living situation. Denki sounded practically horrified at the mention of him living under a bridge but thankfully didn't draw any more attention to it than necessary. Other than that bombshell, Izuku told the other boy he used he/him pronouns, enjoyed the light academia aesthetic, and was quite adept when it came to hero and quirk analysis. Denki lit up at that, bouncing as he asked if that had to do with his offered quirk training. Izuku had nodded enthusiastically, and they decided to schedule a hangout in a few months. Apparently Denki was busy with extra school work the next 2 terms since they both had his harder modules in his science and history classes. Izuku was fine with that, even more so considering he'd be able to see Katsuki before he and Denki officially hung out. So if he'd be okay with the ashy blonde, he'd be fine with the brighter version, he reasoned. Listen, friends were still a bit hard. In any case, all that was all well and good, but now he had school. Putting on the new uniform was very different from his previous school, and not just the fact it was clean and new. Whereas the old era uniform was the classic middle school black for boys, sailor for girls, this school was downright odd. They had many uniform variations, Yamada explaining it was for students with sensory issues, and the basic uniform almost looked like simple soot. Izuku opted for the sweater vest since it was reminiscent of his usual style, and despite not knowing how to tie a tie, he did so anyway. Now, he was standing outside his new class, paperwork with the pros going by quickly with the principal before they were sent off to work. The principal had strange horns growing on his bald head, and Izuku recognized them from an old fight he watched between Mount Lady and some villain during her debut. The man had called him a fanboy again, but it seemed much lighter this time around, which Izuku was grateful for. He took a breath, steadying himself when he was called in. He was a bit shocked once he entered. The class was set up horizontally, with desks on one half, and what looked like floor pillows on the other. The students split rather equally. The teacher looked like a nice man, long black hair reminding him of Aizawa, though the bushy goatee and was that a fedora threw him a bit off. He introduced himself as Rikuta-sensei, and I don't usually do these, but before anyone asks, no, he's not a Discord mod or creepy, this character is literally all the 3 iconic features of my father, my friends actively not recognizing him without his fedora. Don't be weird, people have said messed up things about him because I have a classic pink cutesy aesthetic. So no, though that will be talked about, this character is solely meant to be a cameo so I can write him better, and smiled, before turning to the curious student. Right then, rascals, this is Aoyama Izuku, he'll be transferred for the rest of your 3rd year. He chose not to do a self-introduction, so ask questions at lunch if you feel like it, the man said, a calm but cheerful tone warming the room. Though Izuku's flush was due to his new name. He knew they changed it to hide his identity, while also removing Midoriya from his life, but it was still odd to hear. Aoyama, we're in homeroom right now, so you have about an hour to settle, though the rest will be pretending to study. Rikuta-san got a few shouts for that, and teasing lilts was sent back and forth between him and the students. He bowed a full 90 degrees before hesitantly scanning the room for a place to sit, though that didn't take long. He had a full-body flinch with a pitched yelp when someone pulled on the sleeve of his button-up. Covering his mouth in embarrassment at his embarrassing squeak, he turned and tilted his head barely a centimeter down to face a girl. She wore the mid-calf skirt option, pairing it with the jumper version of his own vest. She had a bow instead of a tie and seemed to be wearing pastel pink and yellow sneakers, pairing them with frilly white ankle socks. However, that wasn't her most interesting feature, it was her eyes. It wasn't rare for people's sclera to have different shades, and unnatural iris colors were more common than a human's natural melatonin levels were capable of. However, she seemed to have neither, pure black gazed back, and the ceiling lights reflected in them as if they had multiple surfaces like a disco ball. She also had a long twitching antenna, and when he stepped back, he caught sight of beetle-like wing shells on her back, which seemed to be covering gold-tinted insect wings with pink heart designs across the clavicle. She had incredibly thick red hair tied into one long loose braid, pink dyeing the tips. Her smile reached her eyes, the suiting of her long lashes doing nothing to hide how bright and big they seemed to be. She rocked on her heels with one arm behind her back, the other waving. Behind her stood a boy, who was the exact opposite, if the definitely threatening glare he was shooting at Izuku was any indication. He had almost floater-looking purple hair, which was extremely thin-looking compared to the girl's. A few more comparisons were their posture, whereas the girl rocked on her feet as if trying to find the perfect angle to remain tall, the boy slouched so bad Izuku worried for his neck. Which was quite funny considering despite the slouch he was still much taller than the girl. He also looked very tired, deep mauve bags lined under piercing violets as if they were designer bags. The girl. Flawless skin. In fact, it looks like she followed K-pop beauty routines if you squinted. The two were opposites, but both equally held unwavering eye contact with Izuku. Hello. He tried, curing the fact he already stumbled over his words. The girl giggled and was a lot more mature and soothing than the expected light bubbly pitch he'd anticipated. You don't recognize me, Izuku-kun? She asked, before ruffling his hair. Then it clicked, he did it the exact same way that Hayami-san. He asked. If her eyes were more expressive, he'd be positive they would have lit up correct. She beamed. My name is Hayami Ishigo, however, you can call me Kai-chan, she said with a subtle bow of her head. And this is Shinsu Hitoshi, my older brother, she said, gesturing to the gloomy boy, whose gaze instantaneously softened when she turned. He gave Izuku a small nod, before being smacked across the arm. Introduce yourself. She hissed, though it kind of sounded unsurprisingly like a buzz. He huffed with a mumbled hey, which seemed to satisfy the redhead. Excellent, she said, clapping her hands together. We often chose to sit on the floor, if you're inclined to join us, but at lunch, we settle outside. Our friend Mai doesn't bode well in classrooms during mealtimes. Hey, Kai-chan said. Izuku was a bit surprised at how polite her Japanese was. She didn't have a foreign accent, so maybe she'd just learned differently. She certainly wasn't using commonly casual honorifics and terms you'd often assume from a middle schooler. Yeah, we're just over there if you want, Shinsu said, his overly casual speech an equally jarring contrast as everything else. Yes. If I'm not imposing or overstepping, he nodded, sparing a glance to the no longer glaring Shinsu. Hayami simply shook her head with an ever-consistent smile as she skipped off. Shinsu just let out a puff of air. Don't worry, was just vibe checking you, the taller one hummed quietly as he walked over the soft pillows. Izuku blanked. Vibe check. Shinsu paused mid-sit. Do you not know what dash? He seemed to stop himself. Of course not, Mom said you were effkin homeless. He almost whispered. Under any other circumstances, Izuku might have frozen up at the comment, but the way the boy worded it made him sound almost guilty. Sorry, yeah. But it's fine. Izuku beamed, an equally bright smile pushing up freckled cheeks. Right. Yeah, the boy huffed before the conversation was abruptly snatched up by Kai-chan. So, Izuku, may I refer to you that way? She asked, barely leaving him time to nod before she continued, let's talk quirks. 0. When the day had ended, Izuku's smile felt almost sewn into his face. He'd always liked learning, and therefore tolerated school, but this was amazing. For one, their teacher never swayed from their homeroom, due to keeping consistency for students who had trouble with changes. At his old school, having his homeroom teacher all day would be worse than any purgatory. However, Rikuta-sensei was incredible. He was as witty and kind as he was intelligent and a good teacher. He found a way to make every lesson enjoyable and had absolutely no issues joking around with the students. Students who didn't even bring up quirks. Students who actively introduced themselves with pronouns and their triggers whenever he'd get introduced. Students who were fun. He even had school friends now. Kai-chan and Shinsu were a given, of course, but after meeting Hatsu, Mai-chan energetic nerd girls apparently liked nicknames, he'd lost his mind. She was Natsu Hatsume's daughter. She was the daughter of the most amazing support hero in the history of literally ever. Apparently, his awestruck mumbling caught both girls' attention, and if Shinsu's grew and dramatic flop into the grass was any indication, he should have been worried. However, when both girls depressed their support course UA goal and gushed about anything and everything hero-related, Izuku couldn't not nerd out with them. Sorry, Shinsu. He'd mowed when the boy looked betrayed. He'd also found out Shinsu's whole cool, quiet and aloof act was really only a front for when he wasn't comfortable. His sister seemed to make him comfortable after he'd gotten over meeting Izuku's new face, and so he was constantly just a deadpanned menace and a surprisingly good pun maker. Mai-chan seemed as if Ishigo's passion, Izuku's rambling, Shinu's casualness, and Yamada's volume fused into one person. Then said person managed to be higher on the neurodivergent scale. It was awesome. When Yamada had picked him up, his terribly hidden worry instantly melted off of his face when he caught sight of Izuku's smile. If Izuku wasn't so dang happy, he'd probably be embarrassed at the way he all but ran into the pro's arms, the blonde's loose green and pink blouse flowing around them as they spun. "I'm guessing it went well, hey kiddo." The blonde all but radiated relief and joy. "It did, better than I could have ever wished for." As the next couple of months went by, Izuku's life never ceased to grow in luck and wonder. School had been going well, his growing friendship with 𝐼𝐸's kids and Mai-chan was unlike anything he's ever had. It may sound upsetting in hindsight, but you can't exactly blame him. Friendships were never usually an option with his quirk status, and even if they were, he doubts they'd feel as welcoming as this. ♯had remained distant, though never cold. Izuku assumed it may just be issues with socializing, anxiety, or something along those lines, and speaking to Kai-chan just confirmed it. The tallest of the group was bullied quite a bit for his quirk, something both he and the redhead were adamantly fuming over. The two were angry from a protectiveness for the boy, as well as empathizing with the bullied kid lifestyle. Kai-chan was also a very close friend, though a few times a week she'd sit with her girlfriend, Uka Kobayashi, who reminded him of pro-hero Lost Boy, so they haven't had quite as much time to bond. He and Mai-chan, however, became close much quicker than he'd expected, and they've even had the girl over for dinner on a couple of occasions, Yamada choosing to offer when it was clear she and Izuku really didn't want to end their conversation. When she'd first arrived, it looked like Aizawa was using every single ounce of teacher patience he could muster not to leave the room. She was quite energetic. He was familiar with the girl, considering her father was a close friend, but it didn't make it easier. That day had also been the first time Izuku called Aizawa Dad, and though he hid the anxiety while Mai-chan was there, the breakdown that occurred once she'd left was something else. It was the first time he'd cried since the diner, and it took a whole lot of reassurance from both pros before he calmed down. He didn't want to overstep, and after some time, he no longer felt that he was. Now he almost exclusively refers to Shouter. He was told the names Aizawa and Yamada were now banned, as dad, and Hisashi as mum. They'd let him choose, and the blonde was overjoyed with his new title. His visits with Mai-chan were much less stressful after that. Which led them to today. Dad had begun training him about a month ago, helping him with the quirkless combat he'd no doubt need. Izuku thought he wouldn't want a weapon, assuming he'd lean towards hand-to-hand, but he was wrong. After noticing how swiftly he handles objects, which was, funnily enough, discovered while he was setting the dining table, Aizawa opted to get Izuku to at least try a few out when it came to weapons. Turns out, he was correct. Izuku's immediate infatuation with both the hook swords and bow staves earning a sheepish guess weapons are familiar from the kid. After beginning to train with more focus on his new weapon choice, Izuku drew up a prototype support weapon that allowed for a multitude of things, but most importantly, it was a combo of both his weapons. Simply put, it was a bow staff that could separate into two hook swords. The mechanics for transitioning, as well as hiding the blades, went over his head, but when he discussed the concept with Kai-chan at lunch, Mai had begun to practically vibrate. Mai-chan was the weapons and tech girl, always excited to make more gadgets. Ichigo was much more focused on costume design and creation but had her fair share of ideas. To no one's surprise, Mai-chan had swept Izuku up after school, barely giving the boy enough time to text his mum that he's been consensually kidnapped before Mai whisked him away. ♯and Kai-chan joined their trek to Mai's house since they live relatively close to one another. Once they'd passed the split that Izuku would usually say goodbye at, the scenery began to change. The aura around him and his parents' that still so weird house was generally clean but rather modern. There were towering buildings and well-kept streets. For as far as they could see from the balcony alone, there wasn't a single street lamp left to flicker, and every bush was kept well trimmed and uniform. Here, however, walking along with the rather old-looking neighborhood his friend resided in, it was like walking through a different city entirely. The houses all had lingering hints of traditional Japanese homes, those with their doors open revealing well-worn tatami mats. Plants grew in abundance, vines snaking across walls, and bushes flowering into vast expanses of color and leafage. The difference was drastic, and Izuku couldn't honestly say he preferred one over the other. His friend's neighborhood felt homey, and his felt special. Both were wonderful. Earth to Izuku. A wildly flailing tanned hand shot across his vision, causing him to stumble back. "Sorry, Mai-chan, was I zoning out again?" he chuckled. "Just a little," 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 responded for them, a soft smile creasing her darkened eyes. But no matter, we just wanted to inform you that I and Hitoshi would be parting from the two of you now, she said, gesturing to a relatively large home, lined with tall sakura trees that still have yet to flower. Oh yeah, sorry, why your house is so cool, 𝐔𝐬𝐴 hummed, admiring the crystal-like adornments that decorated every railing and edge of the standard family home. The decorations are appealing, those are Mama's, she's a big fan of crystals, witchcraft and tea, Shinsu piped in. A few of them match your eyes too, he added, brushing a stray hair from Izuku's face with a smile softer than any he's shown before. Izuku's face had never changed color so quickly, the rapid pace of his cheeks reddening causing him to become lightheaded. Why, I guess they kinda are, he managed, waving goodbye to the pair as they entered their home, stupidly dumb expression plastered across his features the whole time. When he finally dropped his hand to turn to Mai, the girl had a brow raised quizzically. Don't dash, he warned, scurrying past her as she laughed, manic as usual, but without being accompanied by Izuku's initial fear from hearing it. That was cute, she teased, poking his still reddened cheek with a well-calloused finger. Shush! He yelped, speeding up his pace to avoid any other jabs. This continued until they finally arrived at her home, a similar layout to 𝐒𝐭𝐴 and Shinsu's, but a bit more run down. No, that wasn't the right word. It just had a lot of patches. Many of the walls appeared to have blown through quite a few times, and the windows all seemed to have metal blinds. Izuku turned towards his friend with a questioning stare, but his only response was a casual shrug before he was dragged inside. Papa, I'm home, she called, sing-song voice tinged with hyper-excitement. It was at that moment that Izuku blue-screened. He'd be meeting Natsu Hatsume. He'd be meeting the Natsu Hatsume, one of the most genius inventors of their time. He'd made world-renowned support items, including many worn by heroes worldwide. Not even Endeavor is known that far worldwide. With an audible gulp, he followed the girl into what he assumed was supposed to be the living room. Though with the tattered couch pushed in the corner, tarps and char marks along every surface, it looked more like a battle zone. Then, as if by magic, Mai's dad stepped out from behind a door. Izuku once again gasped. The man was muscular, just as Mai surprisingly was. Toned chocolatey skin stood out against a well-worn sleeveless cream turtleneck. The man, similar to Mai, had the same textured pink hair, though his was much longer, tied into long lengths of appealing braids. His nose had a funny-looking crook to it, soot resting neatly against the bridge, and his soft hazel eyes crinkled with noticeable smile lines at the sight of Izuku. Well, hey there, kid. You must be the Izuku I've heard so much about, he beamed, sticking out a gloved hand to the boy. Why yes. That's me. He stuttered out, clasping the offered hand with stars in his eyes, I'm Izuku Ayama. He practically shouted. The man laughed, pleasure. He then turned to ruffle a big hand in his daughter's rosy dreads. Why don't you take him up to your workshop, Mai? He said, gesturing towards the stairs, that seemed to be holding on by a few nails and a single prayer. Raishio papa! She exclaimed, saluting her father before basically dragging Izuku upstairs. Mai's workshop was incredible, Izuku decided after a few hours. He watched over her as she forcefully cranked an unusually large screw into something. It seemed to take a bit of work, but a quick glance to her shoulder, harboring well-used muscle, and Izuku wasn't too pressed to offer his noodle arm help. He once again glances around the room, shelves upon shelves of various metal alloys and hard materials packed tightly into each square. Tools and widgets overflowed bins further down, and expensive machinery lay unassuming in the corner of the room, carefully unplugged from the well-insulated outlets. He'd never done all that much research into the inner workings of support workshops, focusing his own interests on how different hero agencies typically run. However, he's sure to at least dedicate a bit of time to it after this. He glanced down at his open analysis book, a full 2 pages about Mai laid in front of him. He'd taken this time to further the 2 sentences he's had on her, excitedly asking question after question as she worked. He now had many theories and information on the scientific working of her quirk, as well as drawback and applications she'd be able to try, which she enthusiastically agreed to participate in once they got to you. The energy in the room was lovely, and Izuku wasn't even all that bothered by the likely late hours. though he was startled from his thoughts by a rattling loud knock against the metal door. "Come in!" Mai shouted equally as loud, and her father, now in a comfortable-looking warm grey sweater, poked his head in. "Hey, Izuku!" he called, only giving the boy in question a few seconds of panic about his first name before he continued, "I just got off the phone with Sho-chan. Something apparently came up at home. He asked if I'd be able to house you for the evening, so I agreed. Just letting you know," he smiled softly. Izuku's whole body froze. That didn't seem like a good thing. If Izuku's panic was as clear on his features as he felt, his positive he looked 3 seconds from keeling over dead, not that it would actually work. Though to his surprise, a gentle hand-drawing pattern circled into his forearms brought him back. He focused against the creamy dark skin as it soothed his nerves. "Don't worry, Sho-chan made a point to let me know nothing bad happened to them. Your dads are okay. They just need the night to settle something big and don't want to overwhelm you with a change right off the bat," he said, voice smooth and warm, and Izuku couldn't help but relax. Right, yeah, that's good, that's great." Izuku breathed a shaky breath. Mai walked up to his side cautiously. "How about I give you some pajamas or something to wear, and you can tell me all about my quirk?" she offered, usually enthusiasm remaining despite her volume actively being lowered. He smiled gratefully, a simple nod all he managed to get out before she gently took his hand, leading him to her room. After that, he decided to zone out a bit until they settle, barely speaking a word throughout dinner, despite feeling much better. As he entered back into her room, he realized there was a distinct lack of a futon. "Where'll I sleep?" he questioned the girl already settled under fluffy covers. "In here. Next to me," she said as if it were obvious. "That's what you do at sleepovers," she insisted, and what did Izuku know? They both scared at anything related to social norms, Mai explaining it was an unfortunate aspect of her thoroughly diagnosed ASD, and Izuku couldn't help but feel her descriptions of her autism-induced tendencies correlated strangely close to his own actions. No matter the case, he crawled in, settling into the wildly comfortable mattress as the blankets weighed heavily against tense muscles. "This is comfy," he hummed, already feeling his eyelids grow heavy. She agreed, sleep dripping into her voice like a well-oiled machine. She leaned over, wrapping muscular arms around him, fidgeting with the fabric of his borrowed pajamas, tanned fingers blending into the earthy tint of his top. Really though, he couldn't bring himself to care. Mai was his friend, and oddly enough, he felt much less flustered and way more comfortable being affectionate with her than Shinsu, though his flush from earlier may have been a hint to why that is. He let out a content sigh. No use in worrying over his dads now, they'd be in shambles if they found out he didn't sleep, Izuku thought distantly, drifting off. Morning came in an unusual calmness, one that felt rather out of place when with Mai-chan. The window's metal blinds were lifted throughout the night, allowing rays of gold to illuminate the 2 sleeping teens on the bed. Izuku glanced over at his best friend, strong arms still wrapped around him. Her dreads lay in every which way against the bed, one of which was a few shifts away from stabbing her eye. Izuku smiled fondly, gently brushing it away. She looked almost sick when she slept, a peacefulness on her features that was entirely unnatural on the excitable girl. Izuku gently attempted to climb out of bed, but couldn't do so without waking her. After Izuku had apologized, the two had a surprisingly calm discussion about the evening, dreams, and plans for the day as they woke up. Finally, they headed down the stairs. Seeing the homemade breakfast on the table made Izuku smile with gratitude, and Natsu didn't even need to see Izuku's pinched expression to relieve his worry. Apparently, his dads wanted to explain the situation, but Izuku would be heading home as soon as a certain someone woke up. Izuku frankly didn't want to think about what that meant, so he promptly ate his food and joined Mai back in her lab. He sent a text to Auntie Nemirai, hoping she'd know at least something, only to find she was just as confused. They chat a bit longer, the woman letting him know his dads were fine, and even offering a picture of her gear she'd been delaying showing the boy. He was grateful to her attempts at cheering him up and opened his midnight page in his notebook. It was still early morning, but surely it won't take long for a certain someone to wake up. Hopefully, he wouldn't have to wait long. 0. Alas, Izuku never got what he wanted when he hopes, and it took until 3:40 p.m. before Natsu-san received a call. When he did, it took the trio barely 10 minutes to pack what they were doing away and hop in the car. Though the drive was tense, Izuku was more relieved than anything. He wanted to see his parents, no matter the circumstances, and being away from them had been odd. Kids have sleepovers all the time, sure, but most of those kids aren't abandoned homeless ex-quirkless kids. So Izuku's almost positive his normal is far different from theirs. When they pulled into the guest parking at Izuku's building, the car had barely parked before Izuku was unbuckling himself and wishing them a hasty goodbye. Without waiting for a response, he quickly walked past the nice man at the door, sparing the quickest greeting he could before rushing to the elevator. He hopped on one foot to the other, popping his lips in a semi-stim manner to relieve excess stressful energy. They hadn't told him anything, and when he'd texted Mum about it, he'd barely been able to send more than a small text of reassurance before Dad said they wouldn't be able to answer for a bit. Izuku knows they're safe if they say they are. Both being pros and all, his worry comes from the fear of the unknown. He doesn't exactly do well with uncertainty, and if his sessions with Hound Dog or Ruisan brought on one thing, he had a rather noticeable tendency to spiral when he thinks. However, that's due to his attempts to fight anxiety with logic. When the door finally opened, Izuku almost collapsed into himself with the speed all tension left his body. He smiled tiredly up at Dad, who gave him a slight reassuring nod in return, opening his arms as Izuku collapsed into him. "Hey, bud," the pro said, running pale fingers through Izuku's hair as the boy in question gripped tightly at his black sweater. "Hi, Dad, what's going on?" he asked quickly, regretting the hint of desperation that leaked into his tone. He didn't want to sound like being away for one night affected him, but he couldn't really take it back. A lot, he said, barely shuffling the two around as Shouter hit the button for their floor, but in short, Zashi picked up a stray. This made Izuku pause, recognizing the term well from the random dinner parties they'd have with Auntie Nemurai and the detective. They'd called him a stray when teasing Aizawa about the quick past adoption and haste to take the boy in. Does that mean, Dad, is there a kid in our house? Izuku asked, pushing back slightly to stare into the man's tired red eyes. A single sigh, maybe, oh boy, zero. Izuku couldn't call himself an aspiring hero if he didn't catch on to the atmosphere when he entered the living room. It was tense enough to snap and thick enough to slice. He audibly swallowed, gripping onto Dad's hand tightly as the pro cleared his throat, alerting Mum to turn his head. "Izuku!" he exclaimed, much quieter than usual, and movement slowed when he got up to give Izuku a big hug. "Mum, what's happening? Dad said there was a stray. Is it a cat or did you find someone like me?" "A villain maybe. No, that's not it." "What happened is everything dash." He was cut off by a scoff, the noise coming from behind them. Mum pulled away, moving to step aside and reveal a teen standing with fake confidence behind the couch. "I'm almost positive I'm not a villain," the child said, voice tight with practiced theatrics and body language forcibly casual. Gray-tinted pupils looked Izuku up and down, a judgment all too familiar to Izuku as the fellow teen searched for any sort of threat. Their cutely done nails dug tightly into long pink sleeves, and their footing seemed to show a weak body, the same figure Izuku harbored from malnourishment. This kid is hitting way too close to home. Hello?" Izuku questioned, seeming to snap his dads out of their guarded observing. "Right so dash," Mum started. "Izuku baby, this is Nito Monoma. Nito, this is Izuku, our son," he gestured, placing a comforting hand on the freckled boy's shoulder. "Izuku," Nito hummed as if testing out the name. "Cool." They shrugged, going to shake his hand before flinching away, very obviously trying to hide his attempt at formality by running it through blonde strands. As for Izuku, he'd be DM'd not to notice a quirk-induced insecurity, and the way the boy distinctly avoided contact gave away a touch-based quirk. Maybe it was villainous like Shinsu's. But then again, they'd likely be trying to seem less threatening rather than confident. Maybe others found it dangerous. Weak maybe. That options would certainly cause them to want to compensate for that, but then it's nice to meet you. Izuku smiled, forcibly cutting off the spiral before searching for a different topic, pausing before pointing at the other's torso. "I like your shirt," he smiled nervously. "Oh really?" The kids swayed, faltering as he softened, body language and tone seeming weary and almost nervous. I think all the pastel colors suit you. Mum told me this style is a cutesy one, right? The blonde nodded, looking down at the pink and purple design on the shirt, pale blue bubbles surrounding a stylized water bottle. I like it. Izuku chirped, beaming his signature smile to the newcomer. Nito seemed to fluster at this, sputtering some spiel about how I wear what I like. I'm better than anyone who has opinions, and I'm glad at least someone appreciates style. But their almost palpable relief was a painfully obvious tell to their nerves surrounding the clothes. After that horrendously awkward interactions, the group sat down for a very early dinner, one of simple curry and rice. Introductions were in order, as well as things needing to be explained a bit further. So, Mum clapped, quickly thanking Dad for pouring him a glass of water before continuing, let's play a little get-to-know-you game with everyone since Sho barely got to talk with the new listener. Izuku bounced, loving these little table games even if they could be redundant. So here today's format. Say your name, pronouns, favorite song, and favorite desert. Mum beamed, scooping a healthy spoonful into his mouth. Oh, can I go first? Izuku asked, excited to get the ball rolling and determined to ease the younger blonde's nerves. Take it away, kiddo. Izuku swallowed his bite, clearing his throat as he started. So I'm Izuku Ayama, but I prefer if people call me Izuku, and I use he/him pronouns, he began, turning briefly to make sure Nito caught everything before he continued. My favorite song would probably be anything in me and Denki's shared playlist. Izuku spared a quick glare at Dad for the questioning look. And I guess my favorite dessert is carrot cake, but I haven't had many sweets. He finished, shoveling another bite in as he gestured to Dad. The man in question sighed, Shouter Aizawa, jazz lofi, I like apple pie and blueberry muffins. The two family members laughed at the minimalist response, even Nito able to show genuine amusement. Right then, I'm Hisashi Yamada. I use he/him pronouns, but I am a non-binary man, so call me Mrs. if you are to be fancy. He winked, earning a found eye roll from his husband. My favorite song is probably Loverbar by AWOL, or anything by Lizzo, and I like any type of ice cream or cake or anything. He finished, finally pointing a gentle hand towards the newcomer. The person in question cleared their throat, taking a poorly hidden breath of confidence before running pretty nails through shiny blonde hair. You can call me Nito, I use they/them pronouns, and don't you forget that dash, they scoffed, continuing, I don't listen to music a lot, but I like the Korean pop at the malls. I don't like sweets, he finished, quickly shoving food in his mouth before tensing for a reaction, likely negative. A reaction in which Izuku was determined not to give. Cool, a pleasure to meet you, Nito, and yeah, sweets can be a lot. I like carrot cake cause it's like a perfect middle ground. Kai-chan wants me to try red velvet, but Shinsu keeps saying it's just dyed chocolate, which is just a recipe for disaster. He took another bite of food. I mean, they may be close, but siblings fighting is like scarier than any villain. He chuckled, before being cut off by Dad. That's cause it is dyed chocolate. Silence. I swear you better take that back, Hisashi warned, causing an exasperated groan to leave Izuku as Dusty let out a tired meow from the couch, seeming to make Nito jump. Other than that, the relief on the kid's face at the playful banter made a sad smile grace Izuku's features. He saw far too much of himself in the fellow teen, and he couldn't just let it go. After they ate, the group migrated to the living room to discuss the plans and context of the entire situation. Mum had found Nito while on patrol, the specifics of which were kept a secret from both Izuku and Shouter for the time being, as per Nito's request. After a fair amount of trust-earning and persuasion, Mum convinced the younger blonde to come with him to the station. With as little boring or invasive detail as he could, Hisashi explained that Nito too was a homeless child, their parents both being absent for drastically different reasons than Izuku's, of which Mum himself didn't even know, and of which Nito didn't seem inclined to elaborate on. Mum made the decision to take them in, barely informing Dad except for a threat if he refused, and promptly took the kid home. Izuku and his dad shared a quick, knowing look. The insistence likely had to do with the information they were missing, but neither were insensitive enough to press. After the brief explanation of, well, everything, they got the rundown of the next few days. When Izuku went to school on Monday, the two pros and Nito would stay home to move things around and shop. The two kids would sleep in the MSTR bedroom, both with twin beds and their own side. The parent would take Izuku's room. The freckled boy wanted to protest, but couldn't exactly come up with a logical explanation as to why he should sleep on the couch and let the others have rooms, so he begrudgingly accepted, Nito teasing him about selflessness, which would have been silly if their teary eyes at Izuku's generosity didn't ruin the illusion. So with that, they all just sat and talked, sharing stories with the new household member, and Izuku took it upon himself to enthusiastically introduce the blonde to Dusty. When it was clear everyone was tired, Dad sent them off to bed. Thankfully, Nito was able to sleep with Izuku in their parents' big bed, since 𝐿𝐼 was on patrol duty, and Mum volunteered to sleep in Izuku's bed. Once again Izuku found no reason to complain and begrudgingly accepted. He gave Nito a pair of his frilliest pajamas, taking his own simple fern pattern set his favorite cause they were the softest. And they climbed in. Izuku could sense the other's discomfort sleeping with someone else in the same bed, and if Izuku caught on to the way they covered up certain areas with various pillows and carefully practiced positioning, he wasn't going to bring it up. He wasn't sure how to ease the teen's anxieties, knowing something like that was likely learned and couldn't inherently be soothed, something which caused Izuku's heart to snap. Sure, he'd experienced the faintest skim of this situation, scummy men scoping him out and offering generous things in exchange for Izuku acting on sickening demands, but Watanabe-san had chased them off earlier on, and Izuku learned to avoid stuff like that. Izuku hated the thought that this kid may not have been so lucky as to deny certain things, and it made the already big lump in the freckled boy's throat grow. So, he began to quietly talk, discussing his sleepover with Mai, the similarities, his ineptitude in social interactions, Shinsu, Kai-chan, anything to get the other to relax in his presence. To show he's not a threat. In the end, it seemed to work, Nito even asking a few questions as they grew more tired, and eventually, they must have drifted off. Once again their family grew one more person as abruptly and quickly as it had when Izuku joined, and they wouldn't have it any other way. Nito's nails Nito fit right in, Izuku decided. It took little to no time for the household dynamic to shift, and in the end, days turned into months, and throughout those months a new routine was once again formed. Nito clicked quickly with Mai, squeezing into her and Izuku's little group. Shinsu even began to grow closer to the bunch, even allowing the others to call him Hitoshi. Kai-chan and Mai had a field day learning about the newly added blonde's quirk, and Izuku himself couldn't have the heart to deny his own little episode when it had finally been revealed. Hitoshi released his menace of a personality when he and Nito interacted, snarky comments and jabby puns sending Izuku into a mumbling spiral of possible applications in hero use. No one but Izuku ever missed the color that would dust subtly underneath violet eyes and dark circles when the freckled boy mumbled. Hitoshi's eyes stayed locked on Izuku's features, flustered fidgeting bubbling up at every compliment on his quirk, or comment on his positive actions. Though Izuku didn't notice, dense as he was. Along with a different bound, Izuku had begun spending time actually in person with Denki, meeting up once or twice a week to talk about quirks and hang out. He had wanted to wait until he'd seen Katsuki again, originally. If he could face Kacchan, he could face his mega crush. Alas, his liking for the boy and said blonde's insistence, he couldn't exactly say no, and arguably, he had too many friends to feign social ignorance at this point. Though hangout is a strong word, Izuku thought idly, rocking back and forth on his heels as he waited. It was a really nice Sunday, and only 1 week until the exam and a day after Valentine's. Izuku shivered slightly at the cool breeze that drifted along the street, though it wasn't unpleasant. UA's entrance exam was soon, and though Izuku was confident in his abilities, much to his ever-internal surprise, his concerns lay deeper. For starters, he hadn't actually been able to see Nito's abilities yet, even if Dad's reassurance of their skill set should have been enough to convince him. Dad had refused to teach them together, explaining their styles would begin to influence one another, and they'd never learn to adapt, which made sense. According to 𝐿𝐼, his siblings, which he could finally say now abilities were almost unmatched in hand-to-hand, despite the pro's never-ending grumbling of the style. Apparently, 𝐼𝐸 took any and all fight-style inspiration from a series they bullied Izuku into watching with them called Avatar: The Last Airbender, though according to Mum, all of the series' moves were based on practical martial arts, so 𝐸𝐴 couldn't exactly argue. There were more concerns than his siblings' success, however. Katsuki held another. Knowing the systems in place, it was drastically unlikely that Izuku would run into the blonde, whether actually in the exam or after, but he was still nervous. It'd only be a month later that they'd likely see each other again, and even with his parents' reassurance and Auntie Nem being the one to house him once he's released, his nerves still burned both literally and metaphorically with his memories. Then there were his friends. Not just his classmates, but Denki as well. They'd been training together, yet the electric blonde's self-esteem was cause for Izuku's well-earned worry. He sighed, tilting his head to rest frizzy curls against the building's cold brick, pulling the fabric of his scarf up over his mouth. He was wearing the coat Mum had given him the first time they'd gone out, though this time he decided to tie it at the back, leaving his outfit open to the eye. He was actually quite proud of what he'd picked out. He wore a rust and a cream plaid button-up, layering a similar cream sweater vest over top. Any and all accessories, whether it be necklaces or belts, were the same shade as his coat, and the similar rust-tinted corduroy breathes rolled gently to reveal socks that matched his warm white scarf. He finished off the look with his leather shoes, ones which gave a satisfying click whenever he tapped the toes together. He fiddled with the scarf, checking it covered every area it could. He couldn't catch a cold, it'd be too hard on his health considering he was barely healthy at all. He was waiting for Denki, a meetup being scheduled at a cafe, not only to go over everything before the exam but also just to wind down before the said event. Speak of the devil and he shall appear, because barely a few seconds after Izuku thought of what to go over, the boy in question came barreling down the street, slipping on the very minimal layer of ice against the pavement and crashing into Izuku's side. The freckled boy yelped, arms instinctively shooting out to stabilize his frantic companion, steadying his hands against Denki's waist, as the blonde gripped firmly at the shorter's shoulder. Denki was breathing. Deep breaths release minty condensation into the air in little puffs. Izuku raised a brow, an amused smile tugging at his lips. "You all right there?" Denki interrupted him by holding up a finger, digging its unoccupied hand into his pocket. Funny to note Izuku himself hadn't let go of the other's waist. The outfit Denki was wearing today was similar to his usual trendy getup. Y2K wasn't exactly what Izuku would say, considering it was much more masculine compared to the poster board for it. Under a very fluffy green coat, it wore a soft yellow long sleeve underneath a hot pink tee, which sported the classic Bratz bubble letters. He wore simple black jeans, a big chain with beaded yellow flowers between each pair of loops. Bright pink socks stood out against. "Denki, why the heck are you wearing Crocs again?" Izuku whined, tone not adding up to the disappointed gaze Denki couldn't really hold. "Don't worry about it, Zuku." He deflected, finally pulling out a neatly tied bag from his pocket. It held chocolate. Izuku blinked at it, once, twice, before staring at Denki, confused. "Valentine's was yesterday." He began excitedly before its confidence faltered. "I mean they started as gratitude chocolates, for helping me train and all that, and then well, I got carried away because you're just so cool and I was thinking about it and you're sweet, so I mean it was kind of romantic, but not really cause they're still gratitude and you don't have to accept them as anything but that." And Izuku cut him off, wrapping his arms around the boy's slightly toned frame. "Thank you." That was all he said, refusing to acknowledge the tears in his eyes. Izuku's confidence was better now, and though he had no clue why Denki would even consider giving him chocolates with romantic meaning, he wasn't going to question Denki's questionable taste. Get it? Right, why? Denki smiled sheepishly, growing more sincere at the positively radiant grin on Izuku's own tear-strewn face. They didn't get much exam planning done that day. 0. The exam day was here. It was finally here and 𝐼𝐸 was nervous. Many reasons could have been the cause, of course: insecurities, bullies, trauma, self-esteem, their attitude. Really, they didn't want to think about it, even though they really should be working through some shit. Right now, however, they needed to keep their head high, confidence stable, and mind clear, because if Izuku was managing not to CRP his breathes, 𝐼𝐸 could too. Speaking of their brother, Izuku was looking up at the big building, giant H dwarfing the already massive structure as they stood beneath the school's red arch. In front of said entry held many tables, where they'd have their forms quickly scanned to prevent any accidental security door activations. Other than that, the two of them remained in their school uniforms, bags on their backs, and submitted necessities at their sides. Even if 𝐼𝐼 used strictly hand-to-hand, Mai had developed special wrist wraps to brace their muscles, as well as added features such as fire resistance and waterproof attributes, depending on the quirks they'd copy. A gift which she'd gifted them on Valentine's Day, along with horrendously burnt and molten chocolate she'd handed out to their entire friend group, which 𝐼𝐼 may or may not have eaten anyways. They'd trace sure her gift. Izuku had his hook sword bow staff thing, though 𝐼𝐼 really wasn't sure a bow staff was the right word. The hooks were exposed on either end, so it was more of a weird double-sided hook spear thing. Izuku still used bow staff fighting techniques, so at this point, who knows? Izuku stood shaking, hands flexing for something to grab as he settled on a simple shaky hand stim, as one would dry off hands without a towel. 𝐼𝐼 scoffed, a bit more dramatically than they maybe should have as they grabbed their brother's hand, dragging him along. Exam now, fanboy later, they rolled their eyes as the shorter whined, you can be a nerd once we've gotten in. They added, noticing the quick snap of determination across the fellow Ayama's expression. Good. Alas, since Izuku was mumbling to himself, and 𝐼𝐼 had made the amateur mistake of letting go, it took less than a few seconds for the boy to immediately make a fool of himself. By tripping on his own feet. 𝐼𝐼 wanted to catch him, but he was so far, and this was a great opportunity to laugh in proper sibling fashion. Sadly, it wasn't meant to be, and a girl with a rather bouncy brown bob quickly tapped his backpack, sputtering almost if not more than Izuku himself. I am so sorry for using my quirk on you without permission. It'd just be unlucky to trip right before an examinate. She said, far less stuttering and much more confidence than 𝐼𝐼 expected, though the same couldn't be said about his brother's blubbering mess of words. 𝐼𝐼 stepped in, this was sad to watch. Don't worry hun, my brother would have survived a little fall, Izuku gave him a thankful look, but I am disappointed you stopped the teasing opportunity. The smile was now a glare. Kami, why are you so mean to me? Izuku pouted dramatically, the girl blinking once before giggling, warm and light. You two are really weird, anyway, good luck on your exam, hopefully, we'll see each other at school in April, she chirped, bouncing off into the main building. The two stared after, sharing a quick look before following after. To their ever-growing good mood, their exam room was taking place with Hitoshi. Sadly, Mai-chan and Kai-chan would be taking their exam tomorrow, their written test having a few different areas to the other courses' exams, same with the business courses. On top of the girls' practical, it was common knowledge some applicants tried for heroics along with support, and they needed to properly give kids the chance to apply. The girls were missed, but no matter. Izuku gave an absolutely blinding smile to his friend, taking the seat to his right, 𝐼𝐼 choosing the one in front of the tired boy, giving him a Cheshire grin that Hitoshi reciprocated. Hey, you're here earlier than I thought, Izuku mused, and 𝐼𝐼 simply nodded. They noted that other than the three of them, a boy with blue-tinted hair and rigid posture remained unblinking at the front of the class. He looked familiar, but who knows? Yeah, Ichigo and I barely sleep, and because of the nerves last night was a BTSH. Hitoshi groaned, running a hand down his face. Since we were already awake, Mom offered to drive me here on her way to work, he finished, causing Izuku to perk up. Wait, you guys don't sleep? He asked, finger twitching for the notebook he knew wasn't anywhere near. Yeah, insomnia's a beach, and having a mutant quirk related to a nocturnal creature causes a few issues. He explained, Izuku practically vibrating. That makes so much sense, I'd never thought of that. If she wasn't so determined to pursue support, she'd be an incredibly skilled underground hero along with Eraserhead, Cleric and Paladin, Rocklock. Gosh, the possibilities. Her fluidity in Morse code would be incredibly useful, let alone the bioluminescence being incredible for signals and rescue, though her suit would need her stomach exposed. Is that a hazard, or what if he was promptly cut off by a few other students filing in, flush rising to his freckled cheeks. Doing great, Zuzu, 𝐼𝐼 teased, relishing in the groan of disapproval at the vile nickname the blonde would never stop using. As soon as Cementos entered the room, papers were handed out and the test began. 𝐼𝐼 wasn't that confident, but with Izuku's study help, they knew they'd pass this portion, whether with flying colors or scraping the barrel. They hoped. Izuku was stumped. No, it wasn't because the test was hard. Actually, it was so drastically the opposite that it made him feel weird. This was really easy, surprisingly so. Izuku knew he was smart, genius levels back before intelligence and mind quirks really took a jump start in the modern day. He knew this, yet it was still weird. Naturally, those without mental quirks had a rather large section of the brain taken up by the quirk factor. Now, this didn't make them stupid, it just made it so those who were quirkless had a few extra thinking skills. Izuku knew now that he actually did have a quirk factor, but its size justified his completely baseless quirkless status. It was small, considering it was a mutation gene that was inactive. He still had no clue how the even worked, so the speed and ease he had going through the test shouldn't have been all that surprising, especially considering he did fill up the 2 supplementary line sheets for the essay portion, which he was pleased to see was about a villain attack situation, just needing the applicant to write what they'd do in such a situation. Even so, there was still an hour and a half of the allotted 3 hours. He'd taken half the average time. He sighed, knowing that if he went over his responses one more time, he'd commit a felony. Standing up, he went over to 𝐒𝐿, a hero he knew quite a bit about, and refrained the fanboying from getting out of hand as he vibrated in his seat throughout the prose instruction just barely an hour ago. The hero in question raised what Izuku assumed was his brow, quietly addressing him as to not disturb the others. Ayama, if you don't know an answer, you could at least wing it. Leaving stuff wrong is better than blank, he said, and it took Izuku a few seconds of blinking before he smiled sheepishly. Nothing is blank, 𝐒𝐿 sir. And the 2 bonus pages are kind of full, so I can't do much more, huh? He laughed awkwardly, earning a shocked expression from the cement. How could he even read his features? Who knows? Right, okay. The pro said. No one in the class could hear their discussion, but the fact he was sent to lunch after that caused a few shocked expressions from fellow examinees, and to Izuku's immediate discomfort, a judgmental glare from the boy with blue hair and angular glasses that had arrived before the lot of them. So weird, he thought, making his way to the lunchroom to wait for his friends. Izuku was only a little disappointed no one had finished before him. On the plus side, he didn't have to talk to anyone. He quickly slid into one of the booth-style tables in the cafeteria, taking out the bento Mum had made for him and Nito. He chuckled a bit at the design. Izuku had a simple cute bear on his side, but Nito's, well, let's just say Izuku knew what the pink food coloring was for. The rice was pink, the mochi was pink, and even the salmon was pink obviously. It looked like a Sakura wonderland, and Izuku had to stifle snorting chuckles. He set the box aside to wait for his sibling, taking out his notebook to continue working on his 𝐒𝐿 sketch, since he'd seen the man so close up. It was only after a few minutes of this did he realize someone had taken the seat in front of him. Glancing up, he was met with a curious but bright-eyed boy. He had rather messy black hair, chopped at weird layers and hanging unevenly over a scar on his brow. He had almost piercing red eyes, filled with an odd mix of wondering innocence and trained danger. When the boy noticed he'd gotten the shorter's attention, he beamed, revealing carnivore-like teeth that tapered into a hazardous peak. Now, most would be wary of such dangerous chompers. Izuku was not most. Oh my gosh! He shouted, practically diving across the table to grab the boy's cheeks, spreading the sides of his mouth open to examining his teeth, twisting his head this way and that. The boy tried, not able to form a sentence with his lips pulled so wide. Oh sorry. Izuku frantically apologized, narrowly avoiding slamming his forehead into the table as he bowed. I just love quirks and your teeth are so cool and I just thought they'd have some purpose and literally don't even sweat it, man. The boy chuckled, waving his hands a bit slower than Izuku's own. I'm used to it, dude, don't worry. He beamed again. So cool. Izuku muttered, staring starry-eyed at the munchers. The other laughed. They are cool, but they actually aren't part of my quirk, he said. Wow. A genetic mutation. Did one of your parents have it? Or a sibling? Grandparent? Do they affect your quirk negatively? How about diet? That sounds awfully painful. Izuku wanted to continue, but the boy just laughed. Chatterbox, aren't you? Izuku flushed. My name's Ejiro Kirishima, he said, holding out a large hand to the shorter. I'm Izuku Ayama, he said, returning the shake. Looks like we're the first two out of the exam rooms. Kirishima mused. Seems like it. Was it easy for you too? Izuku pressed. The boy tensed. No, I only understood half the questions. But I'm quick, and reviewing stuff is hard, so I didn't really have a chance to second-guess myself. He chuckled. Oh, that makes sense. Well, I'm sure you did great. The two nodded, before Izuku continued. I'm assuming you're trying for the hero track, considering you didn't just go home. Yep. He nodded excitedly. I didn't think my quirk would suit hero work, but my partners convinced me otherwise, he chuckled. Izuku paused. Partners? Plural. Kirishima smiled wide. Yep. My boyfriend and my girlfriend are both also trying out for the hero course. You're dating two people? Izuku wondered. Kirishima seemed to shrink. I mean yeah. It's called polyamory. I know it's weird and most people kinda don't like it, but no, that's not what I'm saying at all. Izuku frantically interjected, relief slipping into his feature when Kirishima relaxed again. It's just I didn't know someone could do that. Izuku tried to clarify, though his gradual mumbling was little help. Kirishima gasped. Do you like more than one person? He asked excitedly. Izuku flushed brighter than he'd ever before. Well maybe. It's They don't I don't think they. Wouldn't I an announcement ring thankfully saved him. He hadn't noticed before, but the lunch hall had begun to fill as they spoke. So, thanking any of the many gods, Izuku abruptly stood up. It was nice talking to you, he said, dashing off to look for his sibling, leaving Kirishima in the dust. What was that about? Ahiro heard the distinct sound of a tired, nasally voice approaching his right. Just talking to someone, Hanta. Kirishima said, turning to smile up at his partner, beaming brighter as his girlfriend pranced up behind the two. Mina wrapped her plump arms around Ahiro's neck, sitting on his lap as she gripped Hanta's hand. That test was ridiculous. I don't know how that kid finished so fast. And his poly too. So much competition. She huffed dramatically, earning a laugh from the other two. Well, we don't actually know if he's like us, princess. Hanta teased, earning an orange-red flush to dust her cheeks at the endearing pet name. Right, true. She huffed. Well, we should probably head to the auditorium, you two menaces. Ahiro butted in, amused. At that, the polycules stood. Hand in hand, they made their way out of the cafeteria, Mina swinging her hands in the center as her partners chuckled fondly. Zero. Izuku rushed up fast to Nito, ramming himself in an almost full-body tackle against their side as he breathed. Whoa Zuku, what the FCK? Nito wheezed, grabbing their brother's shoulders to steady them as Hitoshi cackled. Sorry, exams. Auditorium. Izuku continued to breathe. Nito rolled their eyes. Come on, doofus. They huffed, dragging their brother along. Their middle school paired them all in the same seating area, next to a student Izuku only vaguely recognized as Uka Kobayashi, Kai-chan's girlfriend. Nito gave the girl a wave, startling them for a moment before she smiled, leaning over to the group. Izuku instantly felt calmer listening to her voice. I'm so nervous. She whisper-shouted. The high softness to her childlike tone made him feel all the more confident amidst her nerves. Yeah, me too. Izuku agreed, Hitoshi only grunting in response as Nito nodded. They couldn't talk for long, as Mum stepped out on stage. Izuku beamed, forgetting how his familial bonds to the hero would do nothing to quell his classic hero worship at seeing his parent in costume. Mum's hero suit is so drastically different from how he dresses at home, Izuku and Nito couldn't help but snicker. After Mum began his speech, to a distinct lack of enthusiasm from the crowd, he went on to discuss the rules, point systems, and how things are meant to be played out during the practical. Kobayashi leaned over Nito's shoulder with a glance. Different testing arenas, they mused. Izuku looked over as well, then took a quick glance at Hitoshi's, who lent the group his insight. I don't think they want the applicants working with their friends. He mumbled, Izuku nodding along. It wasn't until Mum was nearing the end of his speech that there was an interruption. "Excuse me." They heard from behind them, a spotlight settling on the glaring blue-haired boy from the written test. "Shoot your question, lil listener." Mum encouraged, finger guns sent towards the boy. "Right," he said, pushing up his generic glasses. "You only described 3 robots, however, our pamphlets clearly show 4. If this is a mistake on you, I's part, it is highly disrespectful to the examinees who expect the utmost class from such an institution." He continued, "Additionally, you with the unkempt green hair," he said, gesturing aggressively towards Izuku, making him flinch. "You left the exam room with such haste and lack of care. If you are to find this exam a joke, I advise that you walk your disrespectful lazy mindset out this hall at once." Izuku was speechless. His friends, furious. Nito, flabbergasted. Mum was a whole other story. Body visibly twitching with the need to stay professional. Izuku was trying not to cry at the accusation, and the other were about to shout at this boy for his complete lack of respect himself, when a voice yelled above the room's murmurs. "Did your old folks shove a stick up your butt? Izuku's one of the DMN's smartest nerds I've met in my life. Just cause you don't measure up doesn't mean you gotta push your lack of intelligence on the BSTRD." Another spotlight landed on the voice. Izuku's breath hitched, eyes meeting those of crimson red and spiked blonde. The boy in question, Katsuki, quickly avoided his gaze, almost guilty, and went back to glaring at the glasses kid. The kid in question spluttered, giving Mum time to clear his throat. "Thank you for the insight, lil listener, but I advise you not to call out other examinees on baseless assumptions. Not very heroic, you know." He winked, causing the blue-haired kid to lower his head in shame. Mum explained the 0-pointers, which had Izuku thinking, but his mind was distracted. "Kei-chan defended me." Izuku was deservingly confused about Katsuki's behavior. Not only did he defend him, but he didn't call him quirkless, insult him aside from the nerd comment, and he complimented him. Izuku would dwell on it if he could, but time was of the essence, and their practice was going to begin. The group made their way to the buses, each giving their own acts of affection and encouragement. Kobayashi handed each of them a small pouch filled with sparkly yellow powder. Her quirk was called pixie dust, and apparently, when she gets overly positive emotions, her wrist glands fizz with a yellow-tinted version of the dust. Kai-chan joked that it was good luck, and now the two follow in the yellow dust luck theory. It's silly, but Izuku felt eternally grateful that she thought of them. Hopping onto his bus, a deep breath was all he got before the reality hit. He could do this. 0, and now, we show all our friends exams, going Hitoshi, Uka, Nito the Izuku, if certain ones interest you more than others. They'll also have varying levels of detail how far they get. First, Hitoshi. Hitoshi may look like a cool, suave, mysterious guy on the outside. He held his makeshift ball and chain with effortless nonchalance, and his eyes remained lidded and tired. This was a lie, of course. Hitoshi was going to throw up, and he wanted to crawl into a corner and hide. He was 0. 2 seconds from calling Kai-chan to come to get him so he could wrap his arms around his little sister from behind and watch her as she sews. This coping mechanism, however, was no help during an exam. Before he could turn green and SHT a brick, a bright-eyed blonde practically danced over to the Hitoshi. Before he could say anything, whether that be an insult to the dope or ignoring the annoying levels of energy, it clicked that he recognized the black streak in his hair. "Denki Kaminari," he said, barely above a mutter. The boy blinked, once, twice, before a wonderfully bright smile spread across its face. "Hitoshi?" he asked, honey, dripping from the shock in his tone, warming and bubbling, and Hitoshi's nerves. "Emichim." He nodded noncommittedly. "Wow. I just thought you were a cutie, but who knew you were Aizu's friend?" He chuckled, causing more flush to spread across the tired boy's face. Yeah, they didn't have much time to chat before the gates began to slowly open. Mum's voice rang out, but Hitoshi knew better. Izuku and Nito had explained a few tips their Auntie Nem gave them, the biggest one. There are no countdowns in a real battle. Hitoshi subconsciously gripped Kaminari's hand tightly, dragging the shocked boy along as he sprinted into the arena. He may be pulling a bit hard at the blonde, but he was faster, and God help him if he saw Izuku's disappointed face because this airhead didn't make it in. Whoa dude, your quick dash, careful, on your left. He interrupted, pulling Kaminari's arm as he swerved, yanking the boy behind him as his opposite arm swung the big metal sphere right into the robot's control panel, using the full body swing with the blonde to add momentum. The bot sparked, fizzled, and creaked, but it was down. Hitoshi spared it a glance. That's 2 points, he turned to Kaminari, only to be met with a flustered gaze of shock. Its hair stood awkwardly with static, and his lashes seemed to spark as it blinked, illuminating his eyes with 1,000 stars. Hitoshi, wow, Hitoshi was gay. Thanks for saving me, man. Kaminari recovered ungracefully, quickly shaking his head before it took his turn to grab the taller's hand. Let's do this. He encouraged, and Hitoshi could only nod, chasing after the boy as they covered each other's backs. 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 fidgeted in place, carefully taping each of her fingers to her thumbs, just like Ichigo had thought them. She was doing her best to avoid irritating the skin around her pixie glands. They already got irritated when she used her quirk. She couldn't afford to fall back on old habits. It was dangerous after all. She went through the metallic band on her arm, Ichigo's first non-costume-related support item. It had been a birthday gift, one to check the chemicals in her BLD, or what would be her BLD. In reality, her BLD was just glorified fairy dust or pollen in most cases. It had many different properties depending on her BLD pressure levels, and that's what the band was for. It was nothing more than a thin piece of metal, almost bendy enough to resemble fabric, but it was anything but. It connected deep into her skin. A weird signal wave thingy was in tune with her circulatory system. She didn't know, Ichigo would, she was so smart. She smiled at the thought of her girlfriend. Before shaking her head, only knocking a few wisps of moss from her bubblegum pink hair. She had to focus. Smacking themselves in the face, she quickly went about adjusting the setting on the brace. The test was robots, all spread about. She'd need to be able to increase movement and destroy things. Easy enough, she had those both practiced. It was hard to explain how her BLD pressure could fluctuate in different parts of her body, but it had more to do with the release glands than anything. They tightened or loosened around a certain point. Pre-sure point. No, she did not giggle to herself. Setting the pressure in her ankle glands, she allowed the powder there to basically give her a weightless feel. It barely lifted her above the ground, resembling more closely hover boot than floating devices, but it's all she needed, smiling as the shimmering powder doused her shoes, making them sparkle. Next, she adjusted the glands in her wrists, the far stronger set, to a very familiar setting. With this one, she'd basically be creating hyper-activated friction sand. The details were a bit muddled, but to make a long analysis short, when this dust made contact with something, it ate away at the material in a sort of really violent rug burn, but for solid materials. It was very dangerous, so she'd have to be careful, but she was confident. With a shout from present MIC, he was Izuku's mum. They were off, and she quickly set a decent pace as she hovered, almost unable to clock the girl next to her, sliding across the ground on what seemed to be a highly corrosive acid. With no shoes on. Oh my gosh, are your feet gonna be okay? She practically shouted over the sound of metal being sawed by millions of little dust particles. The girl, who she noted had skinned the same exact tint as her hair, just laughed. I don't seem that reckless, do I? She teased, sending a rather pathetic arch of gooey acid over an unassuming 3-point. Well, the arch would have been pathetic if it didn't completely melt through the robot, leaving the thing a poor, sad mess of melting iron and fizzing wires. Holy heck! 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 whispered, shaking her head as the girl laughed, a sweet sound. My partners are just over there, we're gonna be working mostly together, wanna join? And how was 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 supposed to say no to such a pretty girl? Ichigo would have her head. Already, Nito felt confident. They ran at full speed into the arena before Mum could even finish his sentence, and they'd already managed a solid 23 points. The other applicants in their group seemed virtually unaware of their own abilities. Any copying Nito had to do seemed laughably easy in the face of what the original holder had been able to accomplish. Currently, They'd borrowed a distinct ability from someone with a vibration quirk. The boy was muttering about other exams, so he'd presumably applied to many hero schools. He wasn't actually using his quirk well, in 𝐼𝐼's opinion. The brunette chose to target the actual robots, doing nothing but causing some minor disorientation before backing off. It was horrendously painful to watch. 𝐼𝐼, on the other hand, had already gotten an idea upon seeing the boy's quirk. They targeted the concrete under their feet, kicking up the pieces of stone with the help of a minor strength enhancement quirk, and shooting them towards the bots. If they closed their eyes, they could almost imagine the sight of Benders out and about, the avatar by their side. Giggling at the childish daydream, they sent a firm stone into a row of 3-pointers, solidifying their now 35-point total. 𝐼𝐼 took a deep breath, glancing up at the digital timer above them. The virtual hero databit had set it up, and they seemed to be perched happily on the floating digits. 𝐼𝐼 admired databit. The small fella was a non-binary icon, and 𝐼𝐼 couldn't help but idolize them. Now wasn't the time to fangirl, though. They had an exam to pass. 𝐒𝐬𝐽 wasn't hyperventilating. That's stupid, you're dumb, a dummy dumb. The lump in his throat is completely coincidental. He was using Kai-chan's breathing exercises to help get him ready for the physical movement, and you can't prove his hand flapping was anything but a simple stim. He's absolutely just excited, that's why he's having trouble masking, he's not anxious, his autism is perfectly controllable. 𝐒𝐽 is bad at lying. He gingerly glanced around where the other contestants stood about, individually analyzing them as best he could. He'd be fine. He didn't even recognize anyone here, so no distractions. He'd be okay. He'll just think of his friends, they'll be so happy when he passes. Yeah. He'd finally calmed a bit, popping his mouth together as his fingers snapped. Stimming had always kept his mind occupied, and it would keep him in motion, vital to reduce the getting ready PRD that came with running. Of course, it wasn't that easy, and when a big, slightly too firm hand landed on his shoulder, it wasn't exactly his fault he began to hyperventilate. If 𝐒𝐽 saw the blue hair and firm gaze, he definitely didn't process it. He didn't like being grabbed. I find it incredibly malicious to distract the other examinees with your obnoxious noises. It is frankly unheroic to sabotage. Grabbing was bad. Furthermore, such distractions are unfit for an applicant at such an institute. That paired with the blatant throwing of your written test, I can't help but think he wasn't safe. You have weapons with you, and I can't help but assume with your past actions today that you are not meant to have them. I demand you turn in the offenses at once. Watanabe-san. He promised he wouldn't get napped. He had to run. If you cannot show the school you are fit for this program, perhaps a disrespect like yourself should just leave. Why couldn't he run? Hey! He snapped out of his spiral, the hand on his shoulder wasn't there, and he was instead wrapped in an embrace. What in the name of Inagi are you doing, Ganko? A girl, while she was thin, had 𝐒𝐽 pressed firmly into a bony hip, arms wrapped tightly around his shaking frame. She was glaring bright orange daggers at the boy, mouth in a pout-like snarl, and teeth black as the night sky. Wait, what had she called him? Kako was clearly suffering from a sort of meltdown, and you may as well have added fuel to the fire of his worries. She scoffed. I was doing no such thing. If I had been making the hooligan uncomfortable, he should have said thank you. 𝐒𝐽 stuttered out, still staring into the fiery eyes that continued to glance at him with worry. The blue boy paused, staring at the two before scoffing. Maybe you are not fit for such a high-past career if a simple display of disappointment sent you into this state. Then, he just walked away. Ganko, you insufferable prejudice. 𝐒𝐽 held onto the girl's god. Does she have any muscle? She was clearly healthy. Why on earth is she waste, only managing to calm her a tad? Honestly, I find it absolutely absurd some children find it acceptable to meander around with such an attitude. She scoffed, pulling away to cross twig-like arms in a pout. 𝐒𝐽 shook his head, focusing. Thank you, for helping me. My name's A pale hand slapped against his mouth, the girl shaking her head violently. She had bells on her earrings. No names. You'll owe me a favor. 𝐒𝐽 blinked her. He expressed, voice muffled. My quirk, I can't do names. So I do nicknames. She explained, slowly pulling her hand away from Izuku's face. Her nails were black too, just like her teeth. Your quirk has to do with names. She nodded. That's why you, my new friend, are 𝐭𝐼𝐲. She beamed. Izuku felt confused. 𝐭𝐼𝐲 was a simple enough kanji, but the only context he thought fit himself deer. A fawn, but close enough. She laughed. No, 𝐔𝐬𝐽𝐽. Before Izuku could absolutely lose his mind, Mum's voice ran out over the speaker. No time to waste on that, the girl seemed to already be gone, and he quickly followed her example. He was in pretty good shape, only just barely in front of most examinees. He quickly took out his hookstaff sword, which needed a better name, definitely, and swerved swiftly down an unassuming alley. If he'd learned anything from his deep dives into coding, an odd, short-lived hyperfixation, many things that ran on patterned instruction had one thing that was hard to fix: getting stuck. Or maybe that was just him. Apparently not, because as he ran towards a thicker opening between two alleys, a bundle of bots was huddled awkwardly together, occasionally banging against each other. Bingo! Izuku mumbled, quickly sprinting along the wall and jumping on a trash bin. Thank Dad. And his parkour bounding time. As he hooked the ends of his fancy stick into the paneling, he counted his points diligently. 321,129 points, and it's barely been a minute. He scurried out the alley, running to each bin clearing and fire escape access to collect the buggy bot points. It wasn't until he'd cleared every section on this side of the city did he hear it. A deafening screech of a noise tore across the testing center, shaking the ground and deafening many contestants. He rushed towards the noise, accustomed to curiosity and a need to do something. He didn't like the feeling in his gut, and the menacing glare the glasses kid sent him as he rushed the opposite way was only more encouragement. He's glad he did. That thing was terrifying. Is that even safe? He yelped, the hand on his staff shaking too much to be useful. He noticed the big fat red zero on the behemoth's metal and was prompted out of his stupor to run with the others. Then, he heard it. A deeply painful sounding cry, animal-like in a sense, but girly in its human tone. His head snapped over, seeing the person from right before the practical, absolutely crushed beneath a heavy piece of a skyscraper. She was whimpering and keening as an animal would, clawing at the ground as a brunette stood, holding her stomach with tears in her eyes. He also knew this girl, she'd stopped him from falling. They both looked in bad shape. And the bot was close. Oh God, they were right below its wheel. Izuku couldn't just stand, he just couldn't. He ran, teeth clenched in a hiss as he slid painfully on his knees against the destroyed concrete, firmly grabbing the concrete. You. What's your name? He asked the brunette desperately, turning to the nickname girl from earlier when she interrupted. F. Fuwashi, and no names please. She choked out, a gurgle to her voice implying BLD. She might have punctured a lung. He nodded. Fuwashi, do you have any quirk left in you? He hurried out, and she could only nod weakly. Good, use it on this, you likely didn't before cause it'd take two hands, right? I'm here now. Let's do this, Joe. He realized he sounded frantic, but he could tell they had barely a few seconds before they may or may not be flattened. She thankfully wasted no time, pressing the pads of her fingers against the heavy concrete, paling significantly as she tinted green. It was clear she was visibly straining with the effort. The wheel was right there. 4 seconds. He quickly, yet gently grasped the wailing girl's thin arms, noticing once again how thin she was. 3 seconds. With any sort of momentum he could find, he spread his feet wide and spun his torso, flinging the girl away from the danger zone. 2 seconds. She crashed into the brunette, sending them both flying back against a building, away from the 𝐒𝐩𝐽-sized bot's crush zone. 1 second. The girl screamed. 0 seconds. A sickening crunch rang throughout the arena. Silence. The ground began to stain. Why was it red? Everything was quiet. No one moved. Thick red liquid pooled beneath the now inanimate wheel of the big metal creature, bits of who knows what scattered about. 𝐭𝐼𝐲 lay beneath that weight. 𝐭𝐼𝐲 had died. 𝐭𝐼𝐲 was dead. Daijun lay shocked, shaking limbs resembling that of lead as she lay heavy against the broken concrete, big tears rolling down the sides of her cheeks as she stared. This was an exam. Surely they would never have allowed a student to perish in such a trivial event. Right. Her cries were pitched high, and the women-like screech of a fox ran out through the drafting city streets. No one but Daijun dared to make a sound. He wasn't dead. Her new friend couldn't be dead. 𝐭𝐼 can't be dead. And somehow, he wasn't. It was unheard of, but as 𝐭𝐼 very clearly was not breathing, no Yurei had risen from the metal scraps. There was no spirit made of BLD, wisps of her new friend's former life. He hadn't died. But how? The robot rolled backward, revealing a glowing, reconstructing boy. His tissue was being sewn together, his skin rebuilding as liquids pumped beneath his skin. Then 𝐭𝐼 jolted, flinging upward like a board of wood, stiff and unyielding, but alive. The arena was silent. 𝐭𝐼 blinked. Okay. I'm okay. We're alive, yeah. Phew. Daijun wailed, quickly joined by Fuwashi as the two ran towards the perfectly healthy boy. He was alive. He was okay. No one was going to die. Zero, All Might was going to die today. 𝐿𝐴𝐼 promised as he focused his attention on the painful grip of 𝐼𝐴𝐼's hand on his leg. He allowed his breathing to slow. Tears dried on his scruffy face, grime layering atop his skin and eyes stinging with strain. His throat felt dry, and his body felt numb, while somehow still being zapped upon nerves. His husband was not in much better shape, still sobbing violently as he gripped Shota's leg, body quivering with too much emotion. They both knew Izuku's quirk. They knew he'd be fine. Shouta had seen his quirk in action before. They had still watched him die. Hisashi had to watch him die. Their son had died, and it could have been avoided. Turning his attention to the shithole that was the #1 hero, his quirk activated and forcibly deflated the BSTD as he blinked in surprise. Shouta could care infinitely less. What the FCK did you do? He hissed, voice cutting through the air like a well-trained knife, sinking its blade into the tense nerves of the other teachers. The hero cleared his throat, a stern, scolding expression on his gaunt features. Now young Aizawa, Nezu was attending to other matters. He left me in charge of the 0-pointers, and I did as asked. He said sternly. Yeah, no F that. Yeah, to make sure they didn't F-King kill a child. Aizawa. There is no reason to use such language. What in the world made you think allowing a student to die in an exam was ever a good idea? Shouta spat. Well, on young Ayama's file, it explicitly stated he had a reincarnation quirk. I had met the boy before. He told me he was quirkless, you see. I simply had to prove it to myself. Heroism is no place for the quirkless. All Might scoffed, and Shouta's BLD boiled. Not only was the stupid illegal, but the F-King blow-up balloon savior complex was a bigot too. F-King hell. You were the hero he talked to that day. You're the BSTD who convinced him to kill himself. He whispered out. The oaf hadn't heard, but if Cleric's whine of shock was anything to go by, he hadn't been too quiet. I'm going to kill you. Hisashi piped in, and the collective gasp throughout the room should have been more satisfying, but at this moment, nothing was. Excuse me, I'm going to rip every single tooth from your mouth and wipe that pitiful fake smile off your bigoted face. I'm going to stab your eyes with a bottle opener, and rip open that scar on your side with a rusty potato peeler, before burying somewhere no one will ever effin' find you, Hisashi said in English, but All Might understood. Who'd think his years in America would lead to his death? The room was utterly silent. Present MIC just threatened the #1 hero. Well, I see this is quite the situation. The cheerful voice of Principal Nezu broke through the silence. Then, his smile became cold, dangerous, and terrifying. Toshinori, I'd like to speak with you in my office. I'd advise you to have your little commission friend on the line, just to be sure, the principal practically growled, before masking his feature once again and exiting the room. All Might rolled his eyes. He rolled them at Nezu, but followed without much complaint. BSTD. Shouta spat, turning just in time to see his husband slump. Quickly steadying his blonde, he glanced him over anxiously. Show. I'm here, Zashi, I'm here. What do you need? Anything at all? I want to hold the babies. We can do that, yeah. He said, leaving the room before anyone could think of keeping them behind. He wouldn't have listened anyway. 0. A week had passed since the exam. Apparently, the results would be delayed. Izuku wondered why. Things had been an absolute mess since the exam day, and that is putting it very lightly. Nezu had a talk with All Might, or so Izuku heard. Apparently, the hero will be a teacher at U.A. next year. Boy, was that thought comforting. Sarcasm wasn't his strong suit, but Izuku definitely thought he had an edge here. He didn't know the details. The topic was a strict no-no in the house for Mum's sake, but apparently, the whole situation was due to All Might. It wasn't clear why the guy did it, since Nezu was being kept tight-lipped, but Dad explained not so calmly that it was some level of quirkism. Yeah, Izuku wasn't exactly surprised. This was the first time Mum has seen Izuku's quirk in action. He wasn't taking the death well. Hisashi was jumpy and overprotective, constantly requiring physical contact from Izuku, and strict with what he was or wasn't allowed to do with friends. Dad promised it would calm down, but it was clear he was grateful for his husband's more vocal protection. Izuku wouldn't argue, and he honestly didn't hate it. Some kids might find it overbearing or suffocating on some levels, but not him. He was homeless for years, after all. He's not going to turn down affection of any sort. He'd be foolish too. As for others in his life, well, that was a bit different all around. He didn't know how to compile the responses into neat packages, so he'll just show you the texts and let you see the in-person reaction yourself. 0. What? Nito shouted. Izuku could do nothing but wince at their outburst. I am kind of died. Yes, you mentioned Zuzu. They shouted, throwing their arms in the air. The two of them were currently sitting in their room, different sides reflecting their current emotions in stark opposites. Izuku was currently perched on his bed, cross-legged on his tan blanket with the big old stuffed bear Auntie Nem had gotten him for Christmas. It was the first time they'd met, and she'd immediately won him over with Mr. Sniffles. It wasn't exactly my fault though. Izuku whined. That's like not even remotely the point. Nito huffed, exasperated as they leaned against their bed. They were currently on the floor, also holding a plushie. It was a limited edition collaboration between Sanrio Co. and Databits Agency. Nito was currently holding the My Melody X Heimstreamer plush, a My Melody bass, with the hero's classic tiara-themed headset and clothes, along with her classic skirt cape thingy. She was definitely a pro hero Nito could imitate, fashion and style-wise at least. They rest their head against pink sheets, blonde hair reflecting the fairy light along with their posters in a silly way. Izuku's sibling sighed, getting up to sit next to him on his bed. I'm only gonna say this once, so you better listen. I'm not gonna waste my precious time repeating myself. They huffed. Stop making me worry about you. You're my brother, alright? Izuku cried that night, and between you and him, Nito did too. 0. Kako. A shrill voice was the only warning before being toppled to the floor outside Recovery Girl's office. He'd been treated by Cleric, the first-year healer course homeroom teacher. Izuku had always been fascinated with her quirk, especially considering the rarity of healing-type quirks. Many healer students didn't have healing-based quirks, and considering the course has such a small class, it's a really good way to put the numbers into perspective. Right now wasn't time for him to fanboy. He currently had a hyper-energetic, super-emotional girl on top of him. Hi. He wheezed out. For such a scrawny thing, this girl was strong as heck. That was so scary. She whined out, while Izuku racked his brain for her name. You're Dsaijuan. Right? He asked hesitantly, and from her responding toothy grin, he must have got it right. Yep, that's me. I came to check on you, but also exchange numbers. She said, shoving an old, extremely beat-up flip phone at him. Odd. No matter the case, they exchanged numbers before heading their separate ways. Daijun, she kind of reminded him of a kitsune. Oh my god. 0. Izuku Friendship Havers, members Kiwi Izuku Hey guys, berries Ishigo Izuku. Pineapple Denki wa Alivego Maigadi Grape Satoshi I see Denki is even less literate over text watermelon my eyes oh my gosh you're alive my bestest of besties what freaking happened berries what Needhan said better be a lie mister, I don't know if I can handle it Kuya, so he already told you. Pineapple dude grapes. If I could kill you a second time, I would. You freaking hazard Tinkerbell Ukaso. His quirk is like immortality. Kiwi something like that, yeah. Grapes, I'm strangling him tomorrow. Pineapple murder is not the answer. Berries. Toshi, stop, mom's a cop. She isn't opposed to arresting you. Tinkerbell, I thought your mom was an elementary school teacher. Watermelon, no, that's their mem. Their is a cop. Kiwi, yeah, she actually helped me during my case. Especially with the 𝐂𝐸Han stuff. Lemon Nito Katsuki grapes, I still don't know why he insists on calling the guy that anymore. Kiwi force of habit. Lemon, that's dumb. Also the shower's free. Kiwi, oh okay, be right back guys. Watermelon, don't die while you're gone. Lemon, your watermelon, frick you. Nito's bedroom. Izuku would be lying if he said he was anywhere near ready for what he was about to do. Anyone who knew the young boy would find it clear he was filled with bundled nerves and overwhelming worry. He was running freckled hands up and down his seatbelt, rubbing the toes of his Marianes together as he continued to glance out the window. He rhythmically popped his mouth together, normally an action he'd try and stifle when around others, but he was with family, and they didn't mind. Hey kiddo, still hanging in there? Dad's deep ashen voice cut through his thoughts, and a questioning look was sent over the man's shoulder. Izuku hummed in a non-committal manner. He was fine, just nervous. Feeling a gentle touch wrap itself around his wrist, he looked over to meet Nito's soft blue eyes, the cloudy tint to their shade bringing him a calmness he desperately needed. His sibling wrapped their ringed fingers gently around his own, brushing his freckled knuckles with their thumb. You'll do great, and if that guy tries anything, Mum and Dad will stop him. The blonde nodded, reassuring not only Izuku but themselves as well. Don't forget about Nemurai, Mum added happily. Yeah, Auntie Nem too. Nito agreed. Izuku smiled, he truly had such a loving family. Yeah, thanks everyone. He smiled gratefully, taking a long, deep breath as they pulled into the parking lot, settling neatly into one of the spaces labeled guest in nice lettering. He would be meeting Katsuki today, for the first time since that fateful day at Aldera. It would go well. He was sure of it. Auntie Nem lived in a rather unassuming, yet very expensive-seeming apartment complex. It was all deep brown and vibrant reds, black accents in all its architecture, and golden curves in its details. They all stepped inside the rather rustic lobby, a familiar face greeting them by the gold-etched secretary desk. Is that who I think it is? The familiar pitchy voice of Izuku's favorite person ever. Okay, not really, but still broke through his nervous spiral. Reikai. Both Izuku and Nito called in unison, rushing up to hug the teen over the counter. How have you been? You haven't visited Kiyomi-san in what, a monthish? The boy asked, adjusting the loose button up to cover his binder a bit better. We had to let her new roommate settle in. Dad huffed, hiding his face in his scarf, as usual. Oh, Reikai nodded in understanding, sorting through a few drawers of paperwork, needing to sign in their visiting papers. Here's an interesting one. They hummed. How so? Izuku asked, wincing at the hysteria slipping through his voice. The boy looked up as he lay out the visiting sheets for Hisashi, seeming to seriously ponder Izuku's question. Running a hand through the shorter part of his white hair, he huffed. He's clearly just out of some sort of therapy, maybe his first time. Crazy how dramatic he is when catching himself saying something shitty, they responded, thanking Mum for the signature. Oh! Izuku muttered, allowing this revelation to simmer. In any case, I'm just glad I get to see you both again. Reikai smiled softly, the crinkle in his cloudy violet eyes an expression only a foreigner could achieve. Speaking of Nito chimed in, sliding in next to their brother. You took the UA entrance exam, right? They asked, faking an uncaring attitude, but it was clear they were quite interested. I did. Reikai nodded, perking up. I thought I might have some issues since the practical was conveniently at the same time I'm supposed to take T-. He muttered, referring to his TS and shots, but recovery girl monitored me taking it after I finished. Who knew she was such a sweetie? He said in awe. Izuku could only chuckle. Reisha's quirk was very in-suited to healer work, even if it had quite the diverse offensive uses. He had long tube-like appendages growing from just above the nape of his neck, tube-like needles attached to their ends. He can use these for multiple things. In an offensive sense, it involves a lot of energy draining, as well as an obvious variety of puncture wounds. However, in a healing sense, the energy he SCKS in can easily be transmuted to someone else, jump-starting the healing process, similar to Recovery Girl's quirk, though still quite different. She really is. Izuku nodded, despite not having spoken much with the woman, only in passing during his quirk counseling sessions with Nezu. As sickeningly sweet as this is, Dad piped up, "We're going to be late." Right, sorry for keeping you guys." Reikai waved enthusiastically, opening the elevator for the group and sending them up to the 6th floor. The nerves were back, but with much less vigor than before. Reikai had that effect on Izuku, calming and comfortable, while also energetic and right. The floor numbers ticked by, and no sooner had they gotten in the lift, did they arrive on the floor, standing in front of Auntie Nem's apartment. "Hey kiddo," Mum said softly, resting a reassuring hand on Izuku's back. "If you aren't ready, we won't force you, this whole thing is for you," he assured, and the boy just smiled. "I'm ready, Mum," he assured, giving his family a reassuring look, honest. With that confirmation, Nito reached for the ringer, and the night began. "Zero, hey kid, they are here," Nemurai called back into the house as she approached the door. This was her baby Zuzu's moment, and in all honesty, little Katsuki's as well. This would be the real test, for both you and their mental health. In a sense, it was like a graduation exam, but like from their trauma or something. "Wait, what?" the kid yelped, a loud thud accompanying frantic slapping against her hardwood floors. The blonde poked his head from behind the kitchen wall, bright scarlet eyes blown wide in panic. "I'm not F-King ready," he squeaked, though if Nemurai pointed out the pitch, he'd surely deny it. "What do you mean SQ? You look fine," she insisted, slowing her steps to the door, understanding he'd only get more stressed, and consequently more impulsive if she rushed. She valued her kitchenware, and doesn't want anxiety-induced char marks on her pots, thank you very much. "I don't F-Kin know. I'm not dressed fancy enough, the table isn't even set. I'm FCK, I'm not done with the tofu." He fretted, small curses were thrown out under his breath. Nemurai huffed, though it was clear the sound was meant to be endearing. "I think you look perfectly fine, hun," she assured, and she wasn't really lying. Katsuki was sporting an outfit that remained nice and dinner-worthy, yet still his style. He sported a band-tee, baseball bear from the look of the faded purple tint. Katsuki had added bleach splatters to the mauve color, tinting it more magenta and even pinkish-brown in places, carefully avoiding the J-Rock band's signature black icon. Over top he had a loose-fitting flannel, with a blend of brown, soft red, violet, and sage green. He finished off the look with a sensible pair of khaki cargo breathes, though they seemed much more faded now, an assortment of jewelry across his hands to his neck all the way to a single green quartz earring in his left lobe. He honestly looked fine, and even styled his hair a bit. "SQ, look at me," she asked gently, smirking a bit as the boy grumbled his way over to look up at the tall woman. She cupped his face with delicately manicured hands. "You're going to do fine, even if it'll be hard. You aren't perfect, but none of us here today ever are, or were," she assured softly, and the irritable cursing would be bad if it were for the mumbled thanks she strained to catch. Satisfied, she made her way to the redwood door, opening it wide with a squealing hop. "Zuzu!" she all but screeched, wrapping the freckled boy in a normally bone-crushing hug. "Oh my goodness, you put on weight, you little rascal. I'm so proud." She beamed, preening in the absolutely blinding smile her little nephew returned. "Why, I did." He giggled, the laughter growing as she squeezed Nito in an equally suffocating embrace. "And look at you," Nemurai purred, admiring the blonde's outfit. They wore a tight pink and purple striped turtleneck, layered beneath a loose-fitting pastel green t-shirt. They had on a blue and pink windbreaker. Purple and blue bubbles were painted onto the bottom of the sleeves and the hem of the jacket, leading down to thin arms covered in beaded candy and decora-style jewelry. Bow, candy, heart, and of course bubble-shaped clips were littered across their hair, and a bubblegum-themed waist chain rested over pastel pink jeans, little purple bows threaded between the rips, and a matching pair of pink socks to finish the look. "Thanks, Auntie," Nito practically glowed at the praise, and Nemirai couldn't help but laugh fondly. Well, come in, come in. Katsuki's making mapo tofu, and he's a spicy kid, so sorry in advance Hisashi, she teased, seeing the way the blonde's face paled. He never did handle spice all that well. Izuku giggled a bit, and she took that as a win. Hey SQA, almost done in there? She asked lightly, leading the group expertly past the kitchen and into the dining area. Be done in a minute. He grumbled, just got a plate the SHT. Nemirai was glad to see Izuku's reaction to hearing the blonde's voice was far from negative, even seeming a bit wondrous. Cool, we'll be in here. She shouted back, assuring them to sit. Nito, do you think you could set the table? Hisashi questioned, and the kid just huffed dramatically, acting as if they weighed 1,000 tons when they climbed out of the chair. Oh my god, and stop being dramatic. Izuku chuckled, entertained by his siblings' antics. Never, they responded, sticking a purple, oh my god, they had one of Reishi's desk candies, tongue out at their brother. As the blonde Ayama set the table, the sounds of food being placed into individual servings could be heard from the kitchen. Nemirai fidgeted a bit with her cardigan sleeves, the soft blue fabric complementing her black turtleneck sweater dress thing quite nicely. Move your elbows, extras. Katsuki said, startling the group as he began to put down a plate of mapo tofu on each of their cream placemats. No one missed the way Izuku's eyes stayed fixed on Katsuki, more specifically, his hands. It was only a little sad. After the blonde miraculously got them all their food in one trip, all it took was a quick prayer and everyone was digging in. Yeah, this was so awkward. Sadly, she'd never been the best at starting conversations, only really continuing them. They sat in subtly uncomfortable silence, until Nito, ever the mood saver, piped into the meal. We should play a question game. They nodded, mind made up. Ooh, sounds fun. Izuku agreed, voice softer than normal. Sure. She clapped her hand together. Right, Sho, care to start us off with a question for the group? She prompted, and the tired man only groaned. Do I have a choice? No, Hisashi responded, earning a laugh from the table. Fine, who's the best Disney princess? Then all hell broke loose. This was a war with no survivors, and Shouter knew it, the madman. Midnight's dining room plus kitchen, Midnight's dining room plus kitchen, Nito's fashion, Katsuki's fashion, dinner was an event, to say the least. When war broke out between the factions of meal guests, it wouldn't be long until a clear divide between teams was shown. Mum, Nito, and surprisingly Katsuki were all for the classic Disney princess, respectively favoring Ariel, Cinderella, and Mulan each. However, Dad, Auntie Nem, and Izuku had a much stronger leaning for the newer, more modern Disney princess. Merida, Elsa, and Rapunzel respectively for the latter half of the group. It was a violent war, and in the end, a truce couldn't stop the bickering ideals of feminism, classical elements, and nostalgia. The kids were told to escape, leaving the adults, the pros, her heroes, to battle out their Disney princess preference brutally. Seriously though, after it was clear none of the adults would relent, Katsuki instructed the Ayama siblings in the dinner cleanup, eventually leading them to his room. Stepping inside, Izuku couldn't help but stare at the completely new space. When they were kids, the blonde's room was littered with all might similarly to Izuku's, no matter how bitter he was at the prospect. Now, however, the small rock band and 𝐒𝐿 seemed to merge into something rather new. He had a messy white bed that took up a generous corner of the room, pushed off the wall only by a dresser covered in different products for not only the boy's hair but his skin too. He had a small TV, wall vines, posters, and vinyl records. A drum set was off to the side of the door, and sat neatly beside a shoe rack filled with Converse. A longboard was perched nicely above the closet door, and a few energy drinks were pulled neatly on a shelf, almost aesthetically. Sorry it's a bit messy, don't say shitty about it though. The angry blonde grumbled, clearing out a space on his bed, fluffy the covers before flopping down. Why would I say shitty? This place has enough shitty already. Nito snarked, and Izuku visibly froze up. Sure, Nito was always like this, malicious teasing with no real negativity behind their words, but the Katsuki Izuku knew and regrettably still loved did not like snark. But, to his surprise, the angrier of the two blondes was hiding a grin. He shouted back at Aizu's sibling. Yeah, but at least this isn't as messy as your dumb SS outfit, he teased, and in an instant, the two were in a back and forth of banter, not unlike the interactions Nito has with Hitoshi. Katsuki was starkly different from what Izuku imagined, and even more so after he said next to nothing about the freckled boy's curious exploration of his personal space. Even when Izuku impulsively took off a vinyl record to examine it, the blonde had no reaction but a fretting glance at his actions, as if worried the shorter would purposefully break the old thing. He was different, and Izuku wasn't sure he minded. He was worried his childhood friend would be a completely brainless husk of his former self, or at the very least a completely different person after the amount of therapy he endured because of the law. However, this was far from the truth, as the blonde was now a definite AS, but one that was far more humane and friendly than the old bully from a few months ago. It was nice. So Katsuki, you took the exam, right? Izuku chimed in past the two's ongoing roast battle. Both blondes looked towards the freckled boy, giving him their rapt attention. Which was a bit weird feeling, Izuku thought as he squirmed a bit. Of course, I did. How do you take to be for Zuku? The blonde scoffed, and Izuku couldn't help but freeze as he put the vinyl back upon the wall. Turning slowly, a lopsided grin across his pale face, he asked Zuku. Katsuki mustn't have realized the name he'd used if the furious flush on his face was anything to go by. Yeah. So what of it, nerd? He tried, and Nito couldn't help but cackle at the poor boy's embarrassment. Yeah, to be fair, this Katsuki was much better than what Izuku once knew. A couple of weeks passed before Katsuki really came to visit the Aoyama household. Dad was extremely nervous, though anyone but his family wouldn't really be able to tell. In the end, a compromise was made. Mai insisted on paying them all a visit soon anyhow, and she really wanted to meet the explosive boy, whether for nefarious reasons or not. Izuku sat waiting in the living room, journaling as the clock ticked a bit. He was wearing something simple today, a collared green button-up, brown knitted sweater overtop with a simple pair of tan corduroy trousers. He had wild pussycat-themed socks, ones he absolutely adorned, and had adorned a set of emerald earrings, though he was convinced they were fake jewels. Dad was decisively thrown out of the house and pulled on a spontaneous date by Mum to give the kiddos some bonding time, according to Hisashi. Nito too had plans, signaled by the doorbell chiming a familiar tune. It was clear this was someone who visited often, since the doorbell really wasn't in a spot obvious to newcomers, and Mai just waltzed in. I'll get it. Izuku called to his sibling, who was meticulously fixing their makeup back in the two's room. Stepping towards the door, he swung it open to reveal the bouncing form of 𝐒𝐿 in front of him. Hey, Kai-chan. Izuku greeted with a smile, admiring the girl's winter-wye outfit. She wore a knee-length pink dress, with a bust-height waistline. It was sewn with a gathering stitch between her chest, a cream color bow matching similarly toned tights. A pink coat with embroidered roses and fluffy inner pieces was thrown on top, cream-colored earmuffs and leg warmers finishing off her look. Her outfit, you look awesome, he comments, bouncing on his toes as he let her in. Same to you, Aizu. Is any Ai-chan ready? She questioned lightly, hovering up a bit. Izuku noticed she wasn't wearing shoes, likely planning on flight the whole day. They'll be ready soon, he promised to put his notebook on the coffee table. Want some tea? He asked lightly, and at 𝐒𝐿's enthusiastic nod, he started right away. The girl herself fluttered about the room, beetle-like shell on her wings lifted for flight. As the freckled boy boiled the water, he noticed the slits in her coat and couldn't help his curiosity. Do those little holes not let air in? Don't you get cold? Concern dripped from his tone, making sure to warm her cup a bit more than usual. She turned with a sheepish smile. It can be a bit chilly, yeah, but it's cute. And there's not much you can do for mutant quirks like mine, she chuckled, black eyes staring unfocused at Izuku, unable to pinpoint the pupil in the sea of inky black. He nodded slowly. You should develop something, he said, offering her tea. You are in the support course after all. She hummed at the prospect, and they bounced ideas back and forth for a bit. Finally, their conversation ended when Nito burst from their room, a big puffy patchwork coat dripped in pastel tones, paired with a big beanie, big boots, and "Nito, why do you have shorts on?" Izuku asked. "No," scolded. The blonde simply scoffed, looking at Ichigo with a raised brow. The girl in question shook her head sadly. Izuku sighed. "Don't come to me when you get a cold." And with that, the two waved him off, leaving the boy all to his lonesome. Well, until an enthusiastic slam was heard at the door, giving little time for preparation as an overactive Mai collided with Izuku's side. "Hi Mai." He greeted casually, flat on his back as she bounced off of him. "Izuku, is the hyperactive nitrodiaphoresis glycerine here?" She questioned excitedly, and Izuku had to take a full moment to process her words. She combined nitroglycerine and a scientific description of sweat together. That better not be a nickname for Katsuki. After all, it was far too long. "He'll be here soon," Izuku promised with a laugh, and his best friend was resigned to impatiently grumble about the kitchen. The family had taken to storing strawberry-flavored snacks for her when she'd visit, and Mai took full advantage of this fact. Izuku watched her meander with a little grin. She had on a typical outfit, a big grey hoodie, a white pleated skirt, and white and black sports socks. She had her black headphones around her neck and a white baseball cap placed atop her pink dreads. She looked relatively normal if it weren't for the massive bag of smoking gadgets on her back. It took a little less than a half hour for a hesitant knock to sound at the door, and it took just over a half second for Mai to tackle Katsuki where he stood. "What the actual FCK, Zuku? No, wait, who the FCK are you?" he shouted, trying to shove the girl off without his quirk, Izuku might add. "Shocking, really. Hatsu Mai, Izuku's best friend and personal support agent at your service," she exclaimed quickly, bouncing on Katsuki's lap with excitement. The boy in question, ever the one to be open about his attraction to any and all genders, flushed a furious shade of red, imitating his fiery eyes. Get off of me," he yelped, finally shoving her off as Izuku cackled. "Stop laughing, nerd," she screeched at the shorter, grumbling past and into the house when he refused to quit it. Katsuki was wearing a loose-fitted brown button-up, baggy faded black briefs, and bright red Converse accompanied by his camo green socks and bag. "You guys essay," as he spat, flopping down on the couch as the two followed, stifling their giggles. Within a few minutes, the group was engaged in enthusiastic conversation, bonding over their mutual love for academics, knowledge, and hero society. Whether Izuku and Mai could admit its flaws to the ever-hero-worshipping Katsuki was left to be seen. "Wait, so Katsuki," Izuku said suddenly, halting their little drawing game. "H&M." The blonde grunted in question, sparing him a glance. "Since you live with Auntie Nem, are you friends with Reikai?" he asked, and the blonde scoffed loudly. "Friends is a strong word, Zuku. I didn't have a choice in the matter, the guy practically kidnapped me," he mumbled, slamming a paper down with a hero suit design dead center. It looked frankly ridiculous. "Heh, that adds up for him," Izuku agreed, placing his own design down with much gentler hands. "He seems really cool." Mai agreed, placing her own, well-drawn, perfect design. "Show off." Katsuki spat quietly at her piece. "He apparently got in, not sure what class though." Izuku beamed. Katsuki groaned at this, further spurring the freckled boy on. "Why, you don't like him?" Izuku interrogated, followed quickly by Mai. "His quirk is absolutely fascinating," Katz huffed. "His fine and all, I'm just worried about his weak-ass nerd arms, and I like FCK. I don't want people to tease him, you know," the blonde explained, scowl etched into his face as he thought. "Why would people make fun of him?" Mai asked, tilting her head to the side as she did so. Izuku had an idea but wondered if his thoughts were lining up with their friends. "It's just knowing what I know about bullying and shooty. The fact is, like, you know, trans, I worried. People are assholes and he's one sensitive ass guy, you know." Katsuki grumbled out, shocking the other two into silence. Now that they thought about it, queerness wasn't exactly something any of them thought of when it came to you. The junior high the Heiami Shinsu family attended with the Ayamas was very queer-friendly, and considering Nito and Izuku's parents were obvious and employees at UE. However, kids could be assholes. The thought caused Izuku's mind to travel to another path. The boy from the exam, all sharp teeth and big muscles. He was dating two people apparently. Then again, Izuku could have sworn both partners were femme-presenting no matter the fact. The school seems to be overrun with rep, especially with Nito and the currently talked about Reikai. If Ichigo and her girlfriend hadn't decided to break it off, with Kobayashi-chan going abroad and all, there'd be two existing couples already. So there shouldn't be any homophobia, right? Katsuki's room, my style.